Good afternoon. We're going to start in about 2 minutes. So if you all would grab a beverage and a seat, and we'll be starting shortly. Hey, good afternoon and welcome to our annual Orange County Economic and Real Estate Outlook. I'm Jerry Nicholsberg. I'm the faculty director of the UCLA Anderson Forecast, and I'm on the economics faculty at UCLA. And this year, we are partnering with our sister school, the Paul Merage School of Business here at UCI. And so we're really happy about this partnership. UCLA Anderson has been coming to Orange County for a number of years. And Ed Colson, who you're going to meet shortly, has been participating with us. And so we have started now the first annual joint UCI-UCLA Economic and Real Estate Outlook Conference. And of course, we'll be tweaking the format through the years. but most appreciative of the partnership that we have just established with UCI. We have a great program today. We're going to lead off with our first panel, which will be two professors from UCI who will talk about their research and their insights. You notice there's some empty seats there. There were more panelists, but they had family emergencies, which of course, unfortunately happens, and that comes first. But I think our distinguished panelists have more than enough insights to make it a real robust conversation. And then we're going to follow that with a panel that's going to be moderated by the Ziman Institute for Real Estate at UCLA. And this will be an industry look at real estate here in Orange County and Southern California more generally. And we'll finish up with a panel looking at the US, California, and the local economy, the Orange County economy. And then we'll all go for our reception and refreshments. So a couple of announcements here. The restrooms are to the right and left as you go out to the door, out of the door. For those who are coming up to speak, I mean, this is a great room, but it's supposed to evoke being down at the beach, right? So, you know, it's the blue carpet, that's the ocean, and here on the dais is the sand. And as you come out of the ocean, there's always that last upslope. There's an upslope here. Don't trip on it. It doesn't look like it, but it really is there. And now before we start, I would like to thank our sponsors for the day. Both of our institutions are public institutions. We could not put on these programs without the generous support of our sponsors, and we are most appreciative. So our principal sponsor of the day is RSM. Our platinum sponsors, Alan Matkins, California Bank and Trust, Cathay Bank, Clark Construction, Leap Development, and University Credit Union. Our gold sponsors are Hub and Pacific Western Bank. At the silver level, Hathaway Dinwiddie and Manufacturers Bank. At the bronze level, MBK Real Estate. And we have our continuing academic sponsor of UCLA Extension. So let's see, that takes care of all of the introductions. So let's move on to our first panel. And so let me move over here. Now it's on. Great. So we have with us today we have problem with the paper. We have with us today two distinguished professors from UCI's Paul Merage School of Business. We have Ed Colson, who's to my immediate right, and Ed is a distinguished professor of economics here at UCI. He teaches economics and public policy and is the director of research for the Center for Real Estate. Ed earned his PhD from UCSD, and prior to being recruited to be here at UCI, he was a distinguished member of faculty at a number of institutions, including Penn State University and UNLV. Ed's research has been on the measurement of rent in the Consumer Price Index, something that we're going to talk about inflation and CPI, and I think it's not well understood. So your research is going to be pretty interesting here. And the implications of that actually for macro policy, bias in residential appraisals, and the socioeconomic impact of home ownership, as well as many other related topics. He's also co-editor of Energy Efficiency and the Future of Real Estate and of numerous journals, and is past president of the American Real Estate and Urban Economics Association. So welcome, Ed. And then to Ed's right is Professor Leonard Lane, who earned his BA and MBA from the University of Southern California and after 38 years of global work experience, earned his DBA from Case Western Reserve University. And in addition to his faculty position, Leonard is president of LL Global Consult, an international strategy development consulting firm. And he has had many roles in his long career in business, including VP Global Strategy for Divine Inc., President, Partner, and Director of LLA Strategic Development Group, EVP Alaska International Airlines, and Assistant to the Chairman of Alaska Airlines. And he currently serves as a Senior Advisor to the Group Chairman of Fung Group of Hong Kong. And Leonard also is an Ironman participant. And okay, so let's get to the substance here. And let's start with Leonard. So, in your experience, both in academia and in your business experience, you've looked at these global trends. And I think it's a non-controversial statement that now, post-COVID, the global trends are changing. And maybe you can take a little bit of time and let us know what you see and how you think those trends are going. And so kind of globally, but also to some extent, how that impacts us here locally, and then we can dig into that a little bit more.
Good, thank you, Ed. Well, first of all, let me put this in context. How many of you here have seen or have done whitewater kayaking? See hands? And the whitewater kayaking and the ones that are really tough, not the kind of boats that go down the river that are rubber, but are in the kayak and are getting beaten all over the place and rolled over and had to do the Eskimo roll to come up. How many of you have gone through that? There's a couple of you. So you're going to kind of understand the next thing of I characterize the world as. I characterize the world now as a whitewater world. It's a whitewater world that is hyper-connected, radically contingent, and fast. And you've got to figure out when I take a look at this world, how am I going to navigate this world so that when I'm looking at the ripples on the surface, which is most of us look at, how do I understand what's causing it all underneath it? And then how do I get my head and my hands all together to be able to navigate my way through that? So I use that as a metaphor to talk a little bit about the global trends. And the question that I would ask first is like, why do I need to worry about it? And so when I sit here in Orange County and you're all aware of that, I could just simply ask you again, how many of you in the last 3 years have had trouble getting something out of your supply chain on time and within budget? Okay, and anybody that doesn't have their hand up, you're lying. All right, okay, we all know it all the way across that. So why do these global trends make a difference? So one thing is we're the third largest economy in California, as most of you know, and I think Ed, correct me too, the 6th or 11th, California is the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. Right? So we're the third largest and the 6th largest, and that makes us pretty good size. The second thing you may not understand or may not know is that we're about between the 60th and the 63rd largest economy in the world. And so when we think about the things that impact the world and impact countries, we also have to think about how it impacts counties and how it impacts us. So I start with that particular point in time. And while we're pretty strong and kind of vibrant and in the industries we have with healthcare, technology, manufacturing, tourism, we face challenges just like any other county or any other country. And I want to talk a little bit about those. What I'm going to talk about are what I call the megatrends that are causing these major shifts in the way that we think about how we do business and major shifts we have in our personal life. And because of my age and my memory is a little short, I've got to use some notes. So let me go down these with you. And none of them are new, but part of my background is I'm a supply chain guy. And so I have to worry about everything that impacts that supply chain. And one big part of me, the Fung Group, is out of the apparel industry. I have to think about everything from the cotton field to the shelf. And what are all the pieces along that line that I have to worry about? And they're all impacted, but I want to talk about next. And this gets to the whitewater world. Is, how do I begin to make some sense out of this complexity? So the first one is basically we've got a major change in the global economy. We're in what I call globalization 3.0. We went from 1.0, we went to the Industrial Revolution, now we're in digital. And there's a couple of things that are really kind of interesting in this one. And this is where really what I call the multinational companies you're now organizing around global collaboration networks. And when I say networks, I think it's important for us to think about is how many of you work in companies that just stand alone? Or how many of you work in companies that are all part of a network to be able to get you anything in your supply chain, anything from product development? You're all part of that. So when you think about that, I think about I'm in a global collaboration network, and what we're finding in the digital age, and this is a key point, I think, the network that learns the fastest wins. And if that's the case, then we need to really understand what are all the changes that are coming around that you know in globalization 3.0. And there's also another geographical shift. We call it the shift to the global south. And what do I mean by the shift to the global south? This is the newly industrialized process of basically companies that have had a history of colonialism from Northern and European states. And so I've got Brazil, I have China, I have India, I have Indonesia, I have Mexico, but I'm now thinking about the countries in Southeast Asia, and I'm thinking about Africa. And for those of you that are sourcing, you're beginning to think about where is this stuff coming from that used to come out of China, now it's going to be coming out of the global south. And how does that, how does that relate to your shipping costs? How does that relate to what's going on in those countries? How does it relate to country risk? And so those are all pieces that I call kind of falling into globalization 3.0. And along with that, how could I not say this, the continued supply chain challenges. You've all heard enough about this, and we think about this whole thing about that we want to watch is the shortages affecting all aspects of the global market. And what are you doing is a question I would ask. Have you identified those? And have you put together your contingency and agility plans to be able to have multiple places to source from? And then how do you deal, as one of my students asked me, he said, how do I deal with these autocratic countries? Do I want to source from those autocratic countries? Well, I have a theory that we call the best of the worst, and said, those autocratic countries may be bad from certain perspectives, but also their economies are growing to the point where they in fact can become an opportunity for us to source and help grow those economies, but also solve some of our supply chain problems. So that's difficult because now I'm dealing with ethics and I'm dealing with values, and I have to make some of those decisions. So that's the first one that I call around 3.0. You guys have any comments on that? Thoughts?
One of the things that you said kind of resonated. We were with some of our students in Shanghai, and we were visiting some of the tech companies, and we said, well, with the intellectual property issues here, how do you deal with that? And they said exactly what you said, Leonard. Those who move fast and get out in front are those who win. And so we don't worry about patents. We just try and innovate more rapidly. But apparently that's becoming a worldwide phenomenon.
And we see it, I see it as a worldwide, it's almost becoming a norm. And if it's becoming a norm, the question is, what are the capabilities that I need to be able to stay in front? And so I'm going to give you an example here is how many here people are in one form or another in the retail industry? And I want to go to Shanghai because I've lived there and worked there quite a while. How many here are in the retail industry? Where's the most innovation in retail taking place in the world? It's taking place in China. I can go to a shopping center in the middle of Shanghai, and I cannot use cash and I cannot use my credit card. I have to use my Alipay or my WeChat Pay to be able to do that. And it's all done electronically. And so when we think about what's going on with 3.0, the other thing I want to make is, where do we go to learn? And this gets me into some of the questions of some of the places we want to go to learn may not necessarily be some of the places that we like to think about as the best places in the world and having all the democracy and all the things we're used to. And so it becomes a really interesting kind of balance on values and ethics and competitive advantage.
And that brings us back to inflation. So when we leave the world of cash and demand deposits, and we are purchasing goods cashlessly or with digital currency, Ed, do you have thoughts about how that impacts our metrics to measure inflation and monetary policy?
Let me turn to the economist to talk about measuring those two things, because you're getting slightly out of my.
No, that was my question for Ed.
I was not expecting that question.
I just thought of it.
Yeah. Spending is still spending. Prices are still prices. Supply and demand are still supply and demand. So I don't think the basics of inflation or measuring inflation is going to change very much. And I don't think our spending habits change because of the existence or greater use of, digital payment systems. I don't actually have a strong opinion that that's going to change very much about inflation, actually. Besides which, it's seems to be very slowly adopted here in the US at least. So no big changes on the horizon there.
Okay, so that's good to know. We don't ever have to revise our models and our analysis.
So let me go on to a couple of other things here on supply chain. I'd be remiss if I didn't really mention this, is we've really got an interesting problem here between the US railways and the West Coast ports that are coming up. And I'm not sure whether they're going to go on strike or not. And I'm not sure if Gene Soroka and the Port of Los Angeles can really begin to answer these questions about automation because of the union issue. But we're losing our competitiveness here in both in the West Coast ports, and we're losing a combination of the global South, which changed the shipping routes, and the fact that you can now go through the canal and come up to Savannah and not have the potential of the union problems or the work restriction problems, and the lack of automation is going to be changing the dynamics of supply chains pretty significantly. Now let me go to a couple other quick ones. One is demographic shifts. There's a huge shift in population growth. We have the rise of India, the rise of China, Indonesia, Southeast Asia. But the point that I want to make on this demographic shift is there's going to be about 3.8 billion new consumers by 2038, and they're going to be in those countries I just mentioned. And that demographic shift is also going to cause a rise of basically social instability in some of those countries. But you're going to watch the fact that those are where the growing markets are. And what is that going to mean within globalization 3.0? The third thing that goes along with that I find really kind of interesting is urbanization. I think we're looking at data that says globally, there's a huge move to the cities around the world with the issue of mobility around that one inside the city and income inequality that goes with it. So and along with that, I'm finding that we need to look at this whole issue of global migration, as we're going to talk later about the labor force and where that's going to come from as we look into the future. And then number 4, before I get into go beyond labor force, you have some thoughts on that, Jerry? Okay. And then the fourth one is the one we all talk the most about, and that's technology. And I'm not going to go into all the details of it here, but basically, for those of you that are engineers, the exponential increase in computing power is opening up huge amounts of opportunities in various fields, from narrow AI to general AI, and what we'll talk about a little bit later. Because of all of this, that also is opening up here in Orange County the opportunity for not a revision, but an acceleration of the growth in chip design, and we'll talk a little more about that in the Ampere initiative that is going to be kind of sort of coming out of the woodwork, and will have a huge impact on the economy here. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about climate change. And with climate change, I'm talking about both food and water scarcity. And so these are going to have significant impacts on people's lives. We're going to have to adapt our businesses to it. A lot of you that are thinking about how are you designing for low carbon footprints? What are you working about your carbon emissions? It's going to have a significant impact on our, on our lives. And when I think about that, I'm going to add energy to it. And when I think about adding energy, I'm thinking about, not only about the environmental problems, water pollution, solid waste disposal, thermal pollution, all of those are problems, but they're also huge opportunities for us, particularly for a number of the businesses that are here in Orange County. And then I'm going to finish up with just a couple more things that I think are important. And that is kind of the biggest one, which is called geopolitical instability. We're operating, as you can read about every single day. You're reading about the war in the Ukraine, we're reading about Sudan today. But there's basically, if you count them all up as I have, there's over 30 different conflicts going on around the world right now. And my guess is if I drew the conflicts on a map, a bunch of those conflicts are in your supply chains. And a lot of those conflicts are in where you get materials from. And a lot of those conflicts are going to where you get some of your people and where you've outsourced things to. So those are the 7 things that I take a look at, Jerry, when I think about the global economy and how I think about how it affects firms in Orange County, all the way from a Broadcom to an Experian to a Western Digital to a Taco Bell. I'll give you one example to close this out on. One of my former students, we went to Israel for our international residential. And I don't know how many of you know this, but Israel does a wonderful job of growing avocados. but they never thought about shipping the avocados to California. However, a major firm that I will not say the name of was having a trouble with getting avocados out of Mexico because of cartels. And now and behold, we suddenly can solve the cartel problem because I can take avocados and I can load them in a 747 and I can ship them here to Los Angeles overnight. And so when we think about geopolitical instability, we think about things that you're reading about in the paper, but I want you to think about a bit deeper. I want to think about the conflicts we see going on around the world and how are those going to be affecting the businesses we run, affecting our lives, and kind of how we have to think about them as sort of a global thinker.
So a lot going on, and I'd like to bring that kind of down to Orange County and Southern California. One of the things that really is going on underneath the surface, under your rapids in the Whitewater. And by the way, I first raised my hand because the Whitewater that I was in, they serve cocktails, but I think that wasn't what you're talking about.
No, probably not, but I'd like to find that one.
But there's a lot going on in terms of the workforce and what workforce we have and the demand for housing. Who lives in Orange County? How is that changing, Ed? What do you think is going to be the path towards a new equilibrium, or do we even have a new equilibrium in sight?
Yeah, I think there's a huge change in the equilibrium, and it's caused by, I don't even have to say it, work from home. Technologies that we have is the technologies that we have that allow us to not live in the place that we work is creating fundamental changes in the way we live and the way we commute and the way we work. And these are going to have, I think, beneficial implications for Orange County. There's various kinds of migrations that are going on. Because we don't have to work in a downtown dense area, at least as much as we used to, we can afford to live farther away from our place of work, even if we're not fully remote, even working from home 2 or 3 days a week, which seems to be the norm that we're progressing to, is going to allow us to have the same commuting costs living farther away. And so downtown Los Angeles has about 2/3 as many pedestrians as it did 3 years ago. San Francisco has 1/3 as many pedestrians as it did 2 years ago. New York has only dropped about 15 to 20% in terms of the number of pedestrians. So the different cities have different experiences, and it does seem to be related to the amount of tech employment that is in particular areas. But the point I was starting to make is that if you don't have to commute to downtown LA 5 days a week, you can live farther away and have cheaper rent. Although there's going to be some changes in the rent profile that are happening now, but you can have cheaper rent, have the same commuting costs, work from home, which a lot of people find pleasant, and that's going to shift population from LA to outlying areas, including Orange County. And so, and we've seen this. This is not news. The other thing that's got to happen, therefore, is that for LA to maintain its relevance and to increase its pedestrian and traffic counts and have the businesses that are in downtown LA survive, downtown areas like LA are going to have to change. Cities in general are no longer going to be centers of production. They're going to be centers of consumption. They're going to be playgrounds. That's how downtown areas are going to be relevant. That's why New York has maintained its pedestrian count more or less, because it's got a huge tourist activity in downtown, in Manhattan and Broadway and whatever. They have maintained that. Whereas San Francisco's got a whole other set of issues, but LA is on its way to being that. It started before the pandemic. Before, if you're a longtime resident of LA, you know that 20 years ago, nobody lived in downtown Los Angeles. But with LA Live coming in and some other consumer-oriented developments, we've seen tremendous growth in the actual living population in downtown LA. That trend has to continue. in order for downtown LA to maintain its viability. I'll stop there.
So that leads to another question. Do places that are wonderful places to live, like Newport Beach and Laguna, do they become bedroom communities for businesses in Detroit and Dallas and elsewhere? Is that a kind of sorting that we're seeing or that we might be seeing?
We might. Certainly, pleasant places to live are going to maintain their property values precisely for the reasons that you've suggested. We're disconnecting the place that you work from the place that you live. I have a nephew who works for some tech company. He just got hired by them. He lives in Minneapolis. He's never met in person any of his coworkers. None of his coworkers have met each other in person. And that's the way some firms can run. I don't see the long-term benefit of that, but I'm old and like Leonard. I'm old and I don't think that that onboarding is the same as acclimation into a company, but we'll see. But Newport Beach, high amenity places are going to always be places that will maintain their population precisely because they are centers of consumption rather than centers of production.
Yeah, and what I was thinking of there was that in a place like Newport Beach, it has a built-in demand for housing for people who are working in Irvine and in the local area, but this increases the demand for housing in those kinds of localities. And so that ought to lead to higher home appreciation and lower home appreciation in some of these other employment centers.
Right. The data is a little bit funny about that because during the pandemic, house prices went up everywhere. There were zero exceptions to that. Every place from Detroit, not to knock Detroit, but every place from Detroit to Orange County, San Diego, everybody had tremendous housing appreciation. That's leveled off. And when you talked about a new equilibrium, we're kind of groping towards that new equilibrium. House prices have now flattened in most places. I don't know about you, but I checked Zillow once a week to check my home value. And it was declining for several months in a row from July, August to now. But now recently I've seen it start to climb back up again. And so it's reached its equilibrium point. I like to point out that the places where people were migrating to if they were leaving Southern California, because this is something I talked about, two kinds of migration. This is the other kind of migration out of Southern California to places like Boise, like Montana, like Las Vegas and Texas and Denver. Those places had tremendous, even much larger than average home price increases, but also rental increases. So that while LA rents pretty much flattened out the last 6 months or so, those places have continued to see accelerations in rent. Only recently, only the past couple of months have those rents flattened out too. So that we're seeing now, again, this new equilibrium where, yes, some people get upset at the high prices and high rents in Los Angeles and Orange County. My attitude is, bye, see you later. Thanks for staying. But if you don't like to live here, if you don't want to pay what's necessary to live here, then you really should move somewhere else and work from home. Or, even if you're working for a California firm, you don't have to live here anymore. And so we're kind of at that new equilibrium. And so I don't know what your forecasters are going to say, but I don't see a huge movement in rents and prices in California over the next, as this new equilibrium shakes out. I don't see a large change in what we're seeing from today.
Leonard.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting distinction here. When I talked about urbanization, I was really talking more about urbanization more in a less developed world where people are moving out of the country and into the cities for all of those reasons. Here we can talk about urbanization a little bit differently, which I think you guys are bringing up. If I think about this one thing about what I'm going to call the fabless chip company, which is we're going to talk more about later today. Here we're thinking about the uniqueness of Orange County, which has a huge capability, whether the people are living here or at least the company is headquartered here. Broadcom's a good example of being able to have the capability to participate in this digital world, because every smart device you have has chips in it. And we're facing an interesting question about where are we going to get them made now, with Taiwan issue and probably under the CHIPS Act bringing things home. The unique thing that I want to talk about here that you bring about is that this is a very unique place to live. And because this is a unique place to live, this can attract the people you need into an industry, like particularly into chip design. And we also has an interesting thing here. We used to have a place of productivity, as opposed to a place of consumption. We can now bring back, under things like the CHIP Act and advanced manufacturing, we can bring back the opportunity for the urban area to have clean productivity in advanced manufacturing. And we're now seeing here in Orange County, we think that will be a driver in the long run. We've got significant number of major universities here. This is a great place to live. This is a place that people can migrate to in order to take advantage of, I'm going to call it kind of this digital world that's evolving.
Yeah, part of that new equilibrium is that if you can attract a sufficient critical mass of educated population, skilled population, because of the consumption amenities, that will attract firms who want to take advantage of the fact that people want to live here. And so it won't be the same equilibrium that we saw before, but centers of consumption can become centers of production, just like centers of production in the earlier decades became centers of consumption.
And let's explore that a bit further. With the CHIPS Act and the inappropriately named Inflation Reduction Act, the US now has industrial policy. And we're seeing continual announcements, including one this week about the opening or the investment in factories in New York, in Connecticut, in Georgia, Texas, Arizona. Yes, we have an educated population here, but is Orange County getting its fair share of this, or is that being passed by because of the high cost of living and at least the perceived business friendliness or lack thereof in California?
It's going to depend by industry. It'll depend by sector completely.
So let's talk about chips.
Yeah. So this one, Brian Haggerty is here somewhere, who's one of the three founders of this. So when we get to the break or after we finish, go talk to Brian about all the details. So I'm going to give it to you at 100,000 feet. I'm not a chip designer, but there's a wonderful book written called Chip Wars, which it has a whole story of how it evolved to here. But the point that I think that gets to your point, Jerry, is this. Around 2000, we basically sent chip manufacturing overseas. We kept the design here, but we sent the manufacturing overseas. Well, now with the CHIPS Act, and as you're all reading about the security issues and everything else, we're starting to bring part of the manufacturing back. But probably the biggest opportunity is where we kept our capability. We never lost the capability to design. And we have the right universities here. I can go all the way from UCLA to UCSD, and we have the capabilities in those schools with USC and a couple others thrown in for probably the best chip design, education, and research, almost anywhere in the world. And because we have that here, I think the point that you're making is by being able to put a certain part of the production capability here, and the production capability has to do with what you need to do the design and prototyping in order to prepare that design to be manufactured at scale. By keeping that here, but adding two other elements. Adding the element of education, which is to train a whole group of people that can actually work into that part of the economy I'm talking about. But also, I'm just looking around the room here, it's also got a leadership and management component to it. And so I think you need to basically add what I call an academy type thing to that process and tap into the educational, and we have a great one in California, starting at the community college level. This was a state, this is a system, and all three of us are in the University of California system. This was a state that was designed where everybody could go to school. whether it was a community college level, the state college level, or the University of California. We have kept that. We just need to, I think, accelerate it a little bit. And those assets are already here. They're already in our locale. Ed, you might want to go on a bit more with that too.
No, I just love the cheerleading. That's great. That's awesome.
So amongst these trends, is one that we haven't talked a lot about, but is important for Orange County, and that is leisure and hospitality. Certainly in the northern part of the county, the hospitality industry is a big employer. What are the implications of all of this with increasing cost of housing, people changing where they're living because they can work remotely, on the hospitality industry in Orange County in particular, but Southern California in general? Any thoughts on that?
You want to take that?
When we did this program 2 years ago,
Yes.
somebody, I forget who it was, talked about the importance of Disneyland to the Orange County economy and how the main impact of COVID was the lack of tourism from overseas that was causing the kind of the difference between Orange County's response to COVID versus the nation's response to COVID. We were doing worse, and the gap could fully be explained by the lack of overseas tourism to Disneyland. So the fact that Disneyland is now bursting at capacity to, for visitors, I would say that, that's a very healthy sign that the tourism industry is back on its feet here.
Right, and if you look across the country, the two counties that have done the best in hospitality both have the same name, and both have Disney, right? Although apparently, according to today's Wall Street Journal, maybe this Orange County is going to do a bit better than the other.
There's a bit of a tussle going on there, isn't there?
A bit of one, yes.
Another thing to think about, and this is where globalization comes into this. Before pre-COVID, we did a significant amount of recruiting out of China for visitors, conventions to come to Orange County. I couldn't mention the name here simply because he was the guy that led that, but he taught at UCI too. Ed Fuller, who used to be the head of international for Marriott, he's the one that pretty much set up all the Marriott hotels around the world. And I joke with Ed about the fact that if you want to know how much he traveled, United named the 747 after him. But his main job was to go basically pull the Chinese tourists to Orange County. And everything that he did was pretty much based upon what was happening in China, which is an export-driven economy, and on the willingness of the Chinese government to let its people travel and to give them enough money to go out and spend. I'm not certain that that is fully recovered yet. And I'm not certain, given what we're hearing and what we're kind of working our way through in the press and other stories about, whether that Chinese tourism will ever come back again. So the interesting question is, I haven't looked at those numbers. If we're bursting at the seams, my curiosity is, what are we bursting at the seams with? Are we bursting at the seams with domestic tourism that are still spending the money from COVID that they had, and that's going to run out in a while? Or are we building, rebuilding the international capability that we have? Right now, we're trying to rebuild our international capability when we're facing the highest airfares we've ever almost seen in history, and they don't have any indication of going down anytime soon. So I think that dynamic would be interesting to watch.
Yeah, so Mark's going to talk a bit about the hospitality industry here in Orange County when we get to the forecast part. But the interesting thing about the Chinese tourists is in 2018, 1.8 million Chinese tourists came to California. In 2021, almost zero. But now that zero COVID is over with, what does that mean for hospitality here? And maybe that's, even if we get a fraction of that, I think that's maybe the answer to your question. But we see this kind of north-south divide between the hospitality industry and the sort of the northern part of the county and the
tech professional industries in the southern part of the county. And that has implications for where people live, implications for transportation. What are your thoughts on that going forward in this new rough rapids trending world that you all have described?
Yeah, I'll sidestep that a little bit because I think what you're seeing happening in Northern Orange County is a tremendous amount of shifting towards consumer type cities that I talked about before. So we're seeing that in Santa Ana, we're seeing that in Orange. A couple of weeks ago, I was part of a panel that was discussing OC Vibe. This is a major new development that's going to surround the Honda Center. It's a multi-billion-dollar project that's going to incorporate, it's going to incorporate the Honda Center for one thing, but it's also going to incorporate a lot of residential, but a lot of office as well. And this goes to this linking of where you work and where you live and how that all has to be hooked up with consumption value in that location. Tremendous amount of retail, but also a tremendous amount of entertainment, which is part of this kind of leisure and hospitality industry. There's going to be 5 performance venues when they're all done, of varying sizes, with the Honda Center itself at the very top, and then smaller and smaller performance spaces for all kinds of entertainment and theater and musical acts. And it's just going to be this tremendously integrated community with value for both, the residents and for tourists. And they actually are marketing this not towards out of town visitors, but towards local people. They want to have something different there every single day so that they'll have repeat local visitors taking advantage of this. And it's just a tremendously exciting opportunity, but it's congruent with stuff that we're seeing in other older Northern Orange County cities.
So does that mean that the people who are working in these venues, who are typically lower income individuals, are going to be pushed more towards the periphery and the Inland Empire in terms of housing, or is something different happening?
Boy, is that a great question. I mean, the issue of affordable housing is pervasive. It's not going away. Every new housing development, in order to get approval, has to set aside a certain amount of their units for low-income people. That's true of OC Vibe. It's true of the development. I live in Dana Point, so you talk about South Orange County. All the developments around there have to have an affordable housing component. It's something the state is very serious about, but it's probably not going to get solved by dribs and drabs. It's not going to get solved by auxiliary dwelling units. It has to be part of a much larger concerted effort to bring what is sometimes, I hate the term, but workforce housing has got to be, a much bigger part of planning going forward.
Leonard, thoughts on that?
Yeah, the interesting thing is we're almost afraid to say workforce housing. I mean, it's almost a little bit scary to mention it because that conjures up all kinds of other sorts of things from the country's past. But if we think about the point that you're making is we want a greater number of people that are living, particularly in this, if they're in direct service, which is what we're talking about, this direct service group. If we're talking about a direct service group that's roughly living closer to where they work, that can have a better quality of life, then we're going to have to think about some way to be able to put them in that area in a way that they can thrive, not just survive, but a way that they can thrive. The sociologist here can probably answer the questions much better than I can because the bulk of my experience has been overseas and it has been in Asia. And as much as I hate to say it, they basically have to build the housing for people that they need in those countries. I'm taking my MBA class to Singapore in September. One of the things I want to point out to them, and Lee Kuan Yew pointed it out in a very interesting talk that I heard him give in 1989. In Hong Kong, he said, we're going to build the housing for people to live here in Singapore. It's going to be government subsidized housing. Now, you may not like that if you're in the private sector, but I got to grow my economy. And to grow my economy, I got to have people that can afford to live here. And I'll give them the schools and I'll give them the other things that they need, but I got to give them housing. So for those of you that have been to Singapore and looked at all the old government housing that they had there, that was built in order to grow the economy, in order to put people to work on that island. Again, it's an unpopular thing in the United States. You know, I for certainly would not want to be quoted in saying I recommend it here. Somebody would tear me to pieces. But on the other hand, I need to kind of think about, if I want to grow the parts of the economy that you're talking about, I'm going to have to do something about that. And I may need to break the old cognitive biases against doing it in one form or another.
And these are the occupations that you can't work from home. So this is absolutely necessary. It's necessary for the environment. We don't want people commuting an hour to get to their service jobs. It's bad for the environment. It's bad for their productivity. There's studies that show the longer the commute, the less productive people are. And so we just have to overcome our negative feelings about dense housing in order to have a thriving economy here in Orange County.
So Orange County is a unique place, to be sure. Beautiful weather, wonderful neighborhoods, beaches, access to the mountains, access to snow if you want to be in snow. So Orange County is relatively unique. We've talked about these broad trends and how they affect Orange County. What are your thoughts on how Orange County is really a leader in addressing some of the adverse consequences or some of the changes in preferences that are in these broad trends that you all have talked about?
Tough question. I think if you look back, Orange County's been a pioneer in real estate development. I mean, basically the master planned community was born and developed here, Irvine, Mission, Viejo, et cetera. These large centrally planned communities took tremendous amount of imagination, a tremendous amount of creativity, a tremendous amount of skill in order to bring those to fruition, because that's what society demanded in that era of the 60s and 70s and even later. I think our thinking has to change. The question is whether or not the human capital that is embedded in the real estate industry in Orange County can rise to meet that challenge in a way that's environmentally friendly, in a way that preserves the quality of life here for people of every income group. I like to think that it can, and I think the leadership that we have in Orange County and Los Angeles can very well rise to meet that challenge if they have sufficient amount of, as I say, imagination and skill.
Leonard, thoughts?
I think I'm going to finish right with Ed talked about. I think to solve this, if we call it a problem, we have to solve what I'm going to call a crisis of imagination. And to be able to do that, we have the capability here. If we can kind of get by, we can put the power of imagination to work and not be stymied by some of the older kind of things that have been holding us back or been holding society back for quite a while.
So lots of opportunity if one is innovative and creative, and perhaps Orange County in this regard will again lead California and the US. So please join me in thanking our panelists. And we missed a couple of topics, in particular the gig economy, due to one of our panelists not being able to be here. But this was really insightful about how all of these important global trends are affecting us here locally. So please join me in thanking our panelists. And now let me invite up the second panel. And where's Tim? Here comes Tim.
Yeah, be careful with that step as you're getting out of the ocean and onto the sand.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you.
So the moderator for our second panel is Tim Kawahara. Tim is the founding executive director of the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate. Tim's responsible for the day-to-day operations of the center, including the development, implementation, and oversight of the center's numerous programs and activities. And if you go on their website, you'll find there are a host of really interesting events coming up. Tim serves on several boards, including the Urban Land Institute's Los Angeles District Council. Tim is he's a double Bruin, a graduate of UCLA and of the Anderson School of Management, our school's executive MBA program. And I'm going to turn it over to Tim for the second panel. So welcome, Tim and panelists.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Is this on? Great. I guess, yes, this is the sand motif here. Is that what this is? Yeah. I feel like I'm in Trader Vic's and needed my tie or something like that. Anyway, thanks for joining us. This panel is titled Real Estate and Construction in Southern California. So you can really sort of go anywhere with that. But we do find ourselves as, and I think we'll be very complementary to the first panel, actually. We talked a lot about some overlapping topics, but we do find ourselves in very interesting times in the real estate sector today. We have inflation, obviously rising interest rates, post-pandemic concerns, capital markets that are virtually frozen. We got failing regional banks, labor shortages, regulatory issues. So a lot to talk about. So we have a very esteemed panel here to go over, touch on at least some of those topics. But first we have Elizabeth Brink to my immediate right here, and she's the co-regional managing principal, Southwest region for Gensler, an architectural firm, probably the largest architectural firm in the world. And then we have Selma Hepp, who's the chief economist for CoreLogic. So you're going to help figure out what's going on with this crazy economy and what's happening with interest rates and everything else. And then finally, we have Carlos Gonzalez, who's the division president, Western region for Clark Construction. A lot going on in that space as well. So why don't we just dive right in? There are very different panelists with different divergent points of view on the topic. So I think what we'll do is just go down the line, and then at the end we can sort of have a conversation among ourselves. So let's start with Elizabeth first. And there was some talk about the equilibrium, and where I think we're still trying to figure that out in the office space, which you are an expert in the office space. So I've spent hours with somebody talking last night about where's office going, and we just don't know. You know, invariably.
You guys figure it out?
No. It's still very much in flux. We have, you know, obviously some people there's gonna be some remote working going forward. And, but some people are starting to come back as well. And the office sector, I mean, you were mentioning downtown. I talked to a broker downtown LA last week, and, you know, the buildings are about not even 40% occupied. They're 38% occupied, something like that. But fortunately, the tenants are still paying their rent. So the question is, when those leases roll, you know, are they going to look to downsize or however? But at Gensler anyway, with perhaps people coming back and concerns about post-pandemic, and what will the new workspace look like? What are you guys designing for in consideration?
Yeah, so this is on, good. Yeah, so I think you're right. There is a lot. It's still a really dynamic market with people really figuring out what it's going to look like coming back. And we're starting to see some things sort of gel within that very sort of dynamic market. So one of the things we're starting to see gel is there's certainly going to be more differentiation. I think there's not going to be a single solution that everyone's going and, you know, everyone's creating workspaces that are all open and mostly, you know, big rooms like this where people can gather. It's not going to be like that. There's going to be differentiation. There are going to be firms that are mostly remote. I think mostly smaller companies are ones that can really handle that. We're starting to see some of the fraying around the edges for companies that have been mostly remote and really trying to bring people back in. But, you know, it's really going to be a lot more about what does your company want? What is your company looking for? What are your goals? What is your culture? What are you trying to achieve with your workplace, and designing those spaces to really serve that? Within those parameters, we're also seeing some trends that are really starting to emerge. One is what we're calling a flight to quality. Quality workplaces are places that can really bring people back, that are going to be, you know, a great enough place to work, beneficial enough place to work, that it's worth the commute. It's worth the drive. People will want to be coming back. It's more of a destination, not sort of the old school office obligation to sort of come in. So that kind of high quality space is really going to be thriving. You know, parts of that are going to be access to outdoor space, particularly in Southern California. We're able to do that, and people are expecting that. and they really want that access to outdoor space. I was sitting outside on the little patio over here, and there were tons of people out there, and some were working and some were talking on the phone and some were just socializing. That kind of space is going to be, really a part of the mix. We're also going to be seeing sort of more amenitized buildings, not necessarily the amenities in the workspace, but in the buildings and the neighborhoods. People are looking for neighborhoods where they can find, everything they might need. We're calling it sort of the 20-minute city, where you can walk to places. We're also seeing, within the workplace, a lot more focus on making workplaces that really work for people, that provide them the spaces they need to do the focus work and the virtual work. So a lot more private spaces, not big open plan environments, but more enclosed sort of private spaces so they can do Zoom calls and they can engage in that way. And then, of course, the spaces that are for connecting, collaborating, building culture, getting to know one another, which is still a really important reason people are coming back. So there's starting to emerge some direction out of the fog, and how you sort of put those pieces together is going to differentiate based on what each company really is looking for.
And that would be both for new construction as well as TI retrofits.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much new office building construction we're going to see for a while on it, to be perfectly honest.
Can't get a loan right now.
So I think it's a lot about, how those office buildings that really want to be competitive are going to do a little bit of repositioning, a little addition of some of that amenities, outdoor space, and then TI stuff. And honestly, we're seeing some companies are expanding their footprint. Some are shrinking their footprint. It's really all over the place. It's not just one direction.
Yeah, I've heard this concept of almost like vertical creative office, where you're going to start having windows that open and lots of deck space,
Yeah.
open space that's built into the.
Yeah, we call it hacking the building. We did it on our building downtown LA, literally opening up the windows, creating these sort of indoor outdoor spaces so that people really, it started when we had to have meetings outside, and it was a much safer way to have meetings, and people realized that it was also really inspiring to their creativity and their well-being during the day.
Your building downtown LA is beautiful. Got some nice tax credits from the city that moved down from Santa Monica. But, So it sounds like Gensler did some surveying on this issue too.
We have done a lot of surveying. We've become very data-driven. We found, so interestingly, right now, what we're seeing, we just completed our last survey, was done in August of 2022. And we did a bunch of surveys during the pandemic, and we had one that happened right before the pandemic. So we some great look back data. But the one that we just completed, the 2022 fall survey, what we found is about people are spending about 51% of their week in the office. And then when we see sort of the most innovative companies are around that same percentage. But we did see some differentiation across, and I know we were talking about this, we did see some differentiation across industries. Again, this is starting to get into this idea that not everything is going to be the same. So you have something from a government kind of, they're spending about 75% of their time in the office. And this again was this fall. And to media energy, they're spending more like 35% of their time in the office. So you're really seeing quite a range across industries. I think since the fall, it's probably been trending up, as you were talking about. A lot more companies are bringing people back to the office. I think one of the interesting things too is when you do sort of a directional look at some of that data, when we look back at before the pandemic, there was hybrid work. People were spending about 81% of their time in the office. So people are still out, they're traveling, they're meeting with clients, they're out and about doing things. And when you look at that data, we track something called most innovative companies, right? And we have a whole set of criteria that we use to track that. And before the pandemic, the most innovative companies were only in the office about 67% of the time. They were actually out of the office much more than your average organization. And when we're starting to go forward at, what we're seeing in the data, what people want, what they say is their ideal, right? Which is where we think everything's going to be trending towards that. Again, the most innovative companies say their ideal is 67%. And the average companies are more in the 63, 64%. So we think, people are going to be coming back more than they are but probably not to that full 81% that we saw pre-pandemic. It's a lot of numbers I just threw out at you guys, I know, but it really is sort of tracking with, somewhere around 67% is really the amount of time people want to be spending in the office and is the ideal for getting their work done.
Yeah, remote work always seemed remote to me. I didn't know what Zoom was until March 2020. So, but to follow up on the previous panel, is there going to be any difference, seeing any difference between, say, suburban office market or downtown core? Is it just geographic preferences?
Yeah, I don't know how long-term this is, and it was sort of referenced in the previous, some of the downtown markets are seeing a lot of challenges, again, around the neighborhoods. I know downtown LA, there's crime issues. We're seeing the same in downtown San Diego. I don't think that's been so much of an issue here in Orange County, but in some of the downtowns, we're seeing issues on transit. People are not feeling comfortable taking transit. Again, drug use, crime. And that's because they don't have the ridership. They don't have the people there. I think a lot of cities are really working on getting the city downtown areas back to be more thriving, getting more people in those areas that I think will help with the uptake. But even in LA, there's more people coming back in sort of a Century City, Culver City kind of neighborhood than in the downtown sort of neighborhood.
San Francisco, obviously, is sort of the poster child. I actually know credit tenants that are leaving downtown San Francisco of the crime and homelessness problem and drugs on the street. So I'll ask you one more question, then we'll go on to Selma. But you invariably, you hear bosses say, well, what's your most important asset? They always say their people. And so they're coming back. And I had an interesting dinner last night with a bunch of young students that were graduating at UCLA. And there was this whole question about mentorship, and like, if you have senior people that are no longer meeting with their younger employees and sort of bringing them along, is that going to be missed, or how do we recreate that in some way? In a remote work environment?
I think that's a really important question. And did you see the New York Times article on Monday? There was a great article in the New York Times. I'm sure that sparked some of the conversation. It was really focused on the importance of proximity, particularly for younger workers in terms of their mentorship, their learning, and how important being in the office is for that sort of learning environment. And we are seeing that. I will say we've seen that with our own organization. It's one of the reasons that we are back in the office a lot more, because we're a learning, and that proximity is so important. We're seeing that with a lot of our clients, and, particularly it's interesting, some of the law firms, the senior partners are like, I'm fine working at home. I got a nice setup at home. I don't want to come in, and the more junior, the younger associates really are asking for them to be in to get that mentorship. And so, they've really had to pull those more senior people back in again for that learning and mentorship. So I think that's going to, in the end, be one of the main drivers for people coming in more. I think remote work, again, there will be some job functions that can do remote work to some extent. I don't think it'll be a long-term, because I do think it really impacts people's learning development, career development on an ongoing basis. So, probably more of a short-term, and people are going to have to be coming back in to get that mentorship.
I agree. It's interesting culturally how these different organizations view that. I think tech companies obviously have been more open to remote, and Goldman Sachs says you need to come back and you don't have a job.
Well, and tech companies are changing. If you're reading the headlines, a lot of them said that right at the beginning. And now they're saying, well, actually, we're asking everyone to be coming in 3 days a week or 4 days a week, because they realize they're having issues with that.
And with layoffs, the leverage has turned to the employer on that side.
One other thing we found in some of our research, which I thought was really interesting, is how important the workplace is also for the sort of social and diversity and inclusion parts of organizations. That, the workplace is where people meet other people who are different from who they are. And that drives different ways of thinking, that drives different perspectives. I think in our survey, we found that 81% of people surveyed said that they had created a friendship with someone of a different race, ethnicity, or background from them at work. And it just really underscores how important the workplace itself is, for leveraging the innovation that comes from diverse ideas and diversity of perspective. So I think that's another piece that's going to be driving people back into the office, how important that is. You just don't get that over Zoom or when you're working remotely.
Yeah, agreed. So why don't we turn to Selma? I would say it's a very interesting time to be an economist these days. Obviously, the elephant in the room is interest rates and what's happening with monetary policy and the Feds and everything else. But real estate, those of you that are in the business know, it's an incredibly interest rate sensitive business. I had dinner last night with a senior manager at Ares, and they have not done a loan this year. I mean, it's the capital market just sort of seized up. But and I know your expertise is really probably more on the residential side, both single family and multi. But what are you forecasting for interest rates? How are you seeing that impact both if you have anything to say about commercial, but particularly the residential market in Southern California, Orange County?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me.
Of course.
So I work for a company named CoreLogic, just to make sure that you guys are familiar. We are headquartered here in Irvine, and our focus is on property-centric data solutions. So hence my focus on residential real estate. But in thinking about mortgage rates have gone up significantly and have had a very detrimental impact on home sales activity, both in residential and in commercial space. To give you some numbers, when mortgage rates started increasing in summer of last year, home sales activity started declining at 20+% year-over-year rate. Now, note that 2021 was a banner year for home sales activity, but even with that, at this point in the cycle, we are down to home sales activity that's lowest that's been since 2007 for California, including Southern California markets. So clearly a big impact of mortgage rates. It has taken a big chunk of home purchase budget. To give you again some numbers, if there is a household with $100,000 income, at 3% they could afford $660,000 home. At 7% they could afford about $480,000. So that's a 30% loss in purchase budget. So we have seen considerable decline in home sales activity, which have also been followed by decline in or deceleration, significant deceleration in home prices. One thing that we are proud of at CoreLogic is that we do have our home price index that's pretty widely used. And so it goes, even to the neighborhood level. So we are able to observe changes rather quickly in the data. But same story, sort of at home prices peaked at about 20% growth rate in spring of last year and have now decelerated to some 3 to 4% year-over-year increase in home prices. Now, previous panel mentioned this, that home prices were actually declining on a month-over-month basis starting in July of last year. And after 7 consecutive months of decline, we have seen a monthly increase in home prices from January to February. And why that's significant is because that's at the same time that we had decline in mortgage rates again. If you recall, mortgage rates peaked at 7% in mid-November and have been declining since, at least through about mid-February, when inflation reports came out that showed more regain or gain in inflation momentum again, which sort of sent markets spiraling again. But one thing that's very difficult at this time for mortgage forecasting is that you have mortgages are priced off of 10-year treasuries, and they're usually priced at about 170 basis points higher than where the treasuries are, or 10-year treasuries. Now, the problem at the moment is that we not only have uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty, and we have uncertainty not just with the Federal Reserve actions, but also with the commercial sector, with banking, commercial office, and then banking's impact on that, but also liquidity in terms of investors in the mortgage market. Investors don't like uncertainty over mortgage rates. And if one is buying mortgage-backed security that originated at the moment, they're very much likely to have a very fast prepayment speed as soon as mortgage rates come down. And so we have, sort of triple whammy here going on in terms of pricing of mortgages, which is what keeps them high and will continue to keep them high going forward. But to give you some number for our mortgage rate forecast, we do anticipate mortgages to come slightly below 6% by the end of this year. So I'm probably wrong, but
Well, I think I've heard Jerry and some other forecasters say it's great being an economist because eventually you will be
Yeah,
right.
eventually, right.
And Jerry will tell us, I think in the next panel where interest rates are going, hopefully, and what the Fed's going to do, maybe what, 25 basis points or something like that. Obviously the collapse of some of the regional banks and Silicon Valley Bank, I know some deals have gone south because of that. And it's obviously the Feds are rethinking what they're going to do with rates. And so that'll be very interesting going forward. Piggybacking again on the last panel, we talked some about migration, about, we've had net loss of migration in LA and in California, and for different reasons. Some is the pandemic, some is cost of living, crime, all the reasons that were discussed previously. Do you anticipate that would have any effect on the supply demand models in housing in California, or is that really not a consideration?
So in California, we have some 39 million people or 13 million households. We lost 200,000 people last year. So that's really a minuscule number compared to how many people we have in California. So, yes, it is something that concerns me, but more so why people are leaving. You're crime, you're talking about, drug addictions, crime, and traffic, and just cost of living in general. But in terms of how many people we have lost, it has yet to have an impact on housing market. Now, home prices, I mentioned, have declined in some areas, particularly from that peak of last year. So if you're thinking where home prices peaked, which they in most markets peaked between April and June of last year, in Southern California, they're down now about 6 to 7% from that peak. Okay, if you compare that to some other markets like the Bay Area, home prices are down 14%, so double the rate that they declined here in California, in Southern California. And you mentioned Bay Area has a little bit different issues in terms of downtown San Francisco and things like that, and also affordability. But when you look at home prices generally, where they've declined, they've not only declined in areas that are losing population, because the same rate of home price decline happened in Utah, in Idaho, in Arizona, in Nevada, all of these states that did really, really well during the pandemic because of, one would argue, out migration from California. By folks that are of higher income and higher purchasing power. So they were able to drive home prices higher there. But nevertheless, this out migration or migration patterns have not impacted at the end how much home prices came up until now.
Yeah, I'll ask you one more question before we move on to Carlos. And this is something that we've been studying at my center, but there's been a proliferation of private equity coming into the single family home for rent market and sucking up large swaths there. They're all coming in, and what impact would that have on the market? We're even seeing new development coming out, from building to rental, which is kind of unheard of these days. But
Yes, so we have had a lot of investment activity in investors coming into California, particularly in latter part of the pandemic, or latter part of last year. But contrary to some media commentary, we are not getting institutional investors necessarily here in California. We're getting smaller mom and pops type of investors. So particularly strong activity among investors that have 3 to 10 properties or slightly bit larger. The institutional investors are mostly active in areas that have huge population growth, such as Southeast, such as Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, Texas, so Dallas, Houston, Atlanta, Nashville. So those are the areas where we're seeing a lot of institutional activity. Now, I would say that investors have had an impact on housing markets, despite of what the size of the investor is, on housing markets in California, because we are so undersupplied that, if you have one home come onto the market and it's priced well and it shows well, there will be still a line of people outside the door, irrespective of what fears are, mortgage rates or home price declines. We still have a very competitive market, simply because we have such an undersupply of homes.
I think we have some price appreciation in the Inland Empire, right, in San Bernardino,
yes,
Riverside
right.
area.
Right.
So do you track that market as well?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the stronger appreciating markets during the pandemic because of that movement from LA to
Same
Rivers.
reason, you know,
Yeah, same reasons.
cheaper
yeah.
housing, better
Cheaper
cost of
housing.
living,
Yeah, yeah.
less
mhm.
crime, that kind of thing.
Yeah, a lot of job growth there too. That's
Yeah, a lot of
that's-
it driven by industrial.
Right.
They have a major airport there, so.
Yeah, yeah.
that
And in
definitely-
terms of commercial, if you're looking at commercial sectors, industrial has done really well during the pandemic because obviously e-commerce. And so areas that afford that space, not just commercial, but residential, as an extension, have done well.
Yeah. So why don't we move to Carlos? Obviously there's been a lot of conversation about the cost of construction, cost of labor, cost of doing business there. And, overall costs are up. Some of those costs are really fixed, it's really labor and materials. And so where can you find cost savings in the construction process?
Yeah, indeed, not a lot of opportunities for immediate savings. I just look, we have our director of pre-construction and cost estimating. So this is like a test for me. See if I get the answers right. Stephen will give me some pointers later. But yeah, in terms of immediate cost of construction, we saw a moment of pause right as the pandemic started. Then once it became real that activity was going to continue in construction, and we were dealing with some really congested supply chains, we saw acceleration of price growth. And most recently, we've seen a little bit more stability as commodities have returned, not quite to pre-pandemic levels, but things are better. You don't see the line of ships outside of the Port of Long Beach, so those things are helping from a commodity pricing. And the other thing that's happening is we, the construction companies, are starting to anticipate that slowdown in commercial real estate. No new projects are getting funding in the speculative space. So I think to your question, which is where are the savings going to come from? In the short term, it's going to come from a slowdown in the activity that's happening in some sectors. So the sectors that will continue will benefit from backlogs being down and there being more competition in the market. I think there's opportunities also in the short term, but more importantly in the long term from a productivity standpoint. Yeah, the cost per labor is by the hour, but if you can become more efficient in the use of labor in the long term, things like offsite fabrication, design for industrialized methods of construction, prefabrication, those things are the ones that will create the opportunities for us to deliver assets at a lower price point.
Yeah, and there's always this conversation about labor. You mentioned labor, both organized, union and non-union. You had mentioned that labor had really great timing in terms of their negotiations, and now they have really a lot of leverage in the space. Can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. Sometimes it's better to have good timing than to just be good. And most of the collective bargaining agreements in California expired in 2021 and 2022. So at that time, there was a historically high demand for skilled labor. We had not yet entered the periods of accelerated inflation and interest rates volatility. So when organized labor came to the table with employers to say it's time to renew our contracts, they had very significant leverage. Shortage of skilled labor, high demand, pipelines that looked strong and steady, and there were significant increases built into the new set of collective bargaining agreements. So for the next 3 to 5 years, the cost of labor is going to continue escalating. It had been escalating at 3 to 4%. It'll now be 5 to 6% over the next 3 to 5 years. And that is now built into the cost of construction. As I mentioned before, productivity could help that, but only to a small degree in the short term. And now what they do have is the ability to attract people. I was recently at the Carpenters Union Apprenticeship Center in Buena Park, and after a 4-year apprenticeship, if you are a journeyman carpenter, which you can join the apprenticeship program directly at a high school, you can be making $70 an hour. That is your pay, and then you can get another $20 worth of benefits between healthcare, vacation, pension. So it's a good living. So I hope that attracts people that are interested in having a solid middle-class quality of life and who may not find college to be the best avenue for them. You can make a really good living in Southern California as a skilled construction worker, and that's the carpenters, laborers, electricians have an even more attractive salary and benefit package. So I think there's opportunities here to solve for the shortage of labor by creating really attractive careers in the space.
Yeah, I was actually at the Carpenters Union training facility a couple of weeks ago. I accidentally went into the Rose Hope. But no, it's amazing what they're doing. But labor has always been, there's somewhat of a contentious arrangement there, relationship. So some of these contracts and things you think are working out, the friction with labor generally?
Well, there's been harmony because there's been a lot of work and opportunity, and there's been a shortage of skilled labor. So in that environment, labor's had a lot of bargaining power, and developers, contractors, employers have been in a position to say, what can we do to make sure that we're in a good place? If we were to see a more significant contraction in opportunities, you might find a little more friction between the parties. One of the things we have talked about is, are there opportunities for developers and labor to come together and make projects more feasible? And there are examples of that. So first, there is a significant amount of construction work that happens by non-union trades. And there, you don't have those established collective bargaining agreements that are driving the cost of labor. But if you're a human being, you still have a decision to make, or do I go work here or here? So even the non-union trades end up being influenced by those collective bargaining agreements. That said, if opportunities get reduced and there is less labor availability, the unions do have some ability to influence the cost of construction. They can make some concessions related to the ratio of apprentices to journeymen. Sometimes labor will actually invest in a project, and they can invest in different ways so they can bring those costs down. But fundamentally, the impact of concessions on the labor costs have a limited total effect on a project. Generally speaking, the cost of labor represents between 27 and 30% of the cost of construction. Even if you had some very significant concessions, say 15, 20%, that is only moving the needle on the project by 3, 4, 5 percentage points. So I think that, again, the big opportunities here from a labor perspective is the more that organized labor can embrace creative, new, industrialized methods of construction that can improve quality, productivity, speed of delivery of projects. That's where the biggest opportunity is. And they're smart. I think by and large, particularly out in the West, the unions are seeing the opportunity there. So unions are now hosting sessions at their training centers for robotics. They're training their people on multi-trade prefabrication, modular construction. They're looking at mass timber projects because they recognize they have to continue to stay current if they're going to be able to continue to provide opportunities for their members. And as that happens on the union side, I don't want you to think that's like a commercial for union labor. On the non-union side, people are making the same kind of investments. There are a couple of very strong, large, non-union electrical contractors based in Southern California who work nationally, and they recognize the same thing. So they're investing in their people to train them, to make it attractive. So on the non-union side, people are doing a lot of things to make sure that they create attractive careers.
So with the shortage of labor, there's really not a huge cost savings between union and non-union.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that is true.
Interesting. And the last panel mentioned supply chain, and I think you referenced this a little bit, but commodity prices, I guess you said, are all down to pre-pandemic. I know lumber and everything was through the roof. And then what about supply chains? Is that still lingering at all, or we completely worked out of logistics?
So we're not completely out of the woods, but things are certainly better compared to what they were in 2021, right? I think that I mentioned it before, and especially those of us that live here in Orange County remember driving out to Newport Beach and seeing that line of container ships just piled up waiting for the shot to get into the port. Couple of data points. Before the pandemic, if you had a container coming from East Asia to the Port of Long Beach or the Port of LA, that would cost you between $1,500 and $2,000 a container. I think we've all seen the stories in the New York Times. We experienced this live on some projects where we contracted the work at the end of 2019, and then we delivered product in 21. And we went from paying $2,000 a container to paying $25,000 and $30,000 a container. Some of those costs were transferred over to the end users. Some of them were absorbed by construction companies. So that was a very significant impact just on the shipping and logistics. Those issues, by and large, have been addressed. The ports are no longer jam-packed, congested. We're seeing now the flow of product both by truck and by rail within the continental United States. Commodity pricing, again, by and large, has returned to pre-pandemic levels, maybe not quite, but lumber, gypsum board, steel, stainless steel, saying that the component materials are there, but we're still seeing some challenges from a supply chain standpoint on manufactured items. So the biggest examples, the most painful examples we have are mechanical and electrical equipment. If you build a building, whether it's a house or a high-rise building, you need electrical switchgear in order to bring the power from the street into the building. Before the pandemic, we could get electrical switchgear in 12 to 18 months. It's a customized process. You need to analyze the building, figure out what size equipment you're going to need, and then you got to get in line on the supply chain.
So is that all global?
It is.
So we're dependent on
That's
China and everything. Yeah.
correct. Today, so it used to be 12 to 18 months. Today, it's 24 to 36 months. It's taking longer to get the switchgear made than it takes to build the whole building. We might build the last office building in Los Angeles. We're currently building a 40-story building in Century City that has an anchor tenant. That's why that one's going forward. And it will take us less time to build the whole building, $650 million, than it will to get the gear made from where we already order it, and we'll wait longer for the gear than we will for the whole building.
Yeah, crazy times, huh?
It is. It is crazy times.
And I guess I'll ask one question before we move around and maybe take some questions. But on the financing side, as it's been so hard to finance any things these days. Can you even finance a construction finance loan for a spec project these days, or does it have to be build to suit, or like what's going on there?
I mean, we have not seen any project that was purely speculative get funded in the last 9 months, and that is across the country. So if you are purely building, whether it's an apartment building or an office building, even a life science building, and you do not have a guarantee of who's going to occupy it, unless you're tied to workforce housing or student housing, unless you have an anchor tenant like the one on our Century City project, or if you have a life science company that says, yeah, I want to move into your building, nobody is getting financing. And I think that's a combination of the uncertainty on the return to work culture, as well as interest rates are still moving around. I think for the underwriters, that creates a level of risk that they're not willing to tolerate. What we hear, and this is an indirect conversation, we're not talking to the lenders, but our clients are talking to the lenders. And what they say is, we need stability. We need to know, where is this going to land, so we can actually underwrite the performers with some certainty. And then at the level of interest rates, I think that those were some staggering facts about the reduction in buying power for a household. Well, the same is true on the commercial real estate, right? At certain interest rates, the kind of rent that you're going to need to demand in order to make a project pencil is going to create situations where people say, yeah, I'd love to move, or I'd love to expand, but I can't afford to pay $6-7 per square foot. That would be what it takes to make a project work. And then exacerbating that, especially in the commercial office spaces, there is so much inventory where leases are going to be expiring that won't renew, that we recently saw those 2 buildings in Santa Ana that sold for like a 55% loss versus what Blackstone had paid for them. So in a recent conversation with a developer, they were talking about, why would we build at $300-400 a square foot if we can buy a distressed property for $100? I could invest another $100 to do a facelift. And they're not even ready to go yet, but I think we're going to be in some significant slowdown of new construction, of purely speculative work. The positive news for in our space and for the economy in general is there's still a significant amount of investment in other sectors. So while speculative development is likely to stay stagnant for some time, we see institutions continuing to invest, universities, research institutions. We see still significant investment in the entertainment space. I think a healthy discussion about lodging, hospitality, entertainment, and I think we are blessed in Southern California from Universal, downtown LA, Disney, SeaWorld down in San Diego, and Legoland, the Wildland Park, et cetera. All of those places that create tourism continue to see investment. We actually hear from those clients, they look to invest more in the future as they see themselves as a place that people will want to gather in. Infrastructure, there continues to be a significant amount of investment in infrastructure, particularly all things related to climate change. We heard in the earlier panel how significant climate change is in terms of the impact on the economy. Big emphasis put on decarbonization, reducing the emissions. So you see investments in things like how do we electrify the fleet of public transportation, even places like the airport is looking to figure out how do they take emissions out of their fleet of shuttles. So there's investment in energy, there's investment in water. So we continue to see investment in infrastructure. And then a handful of other places that we continue to see investment in is healthcare. Health systems, notwithstanding the budget challenges they have, continue to be investing. You see UC Irvine has two very significant investment projects in their health campus. We see investment in the industrial space as more direct-to-consumer commerce emerges, and you see the reduction in what I would call middle-class retail. You do see an increase in industrial construction for the distribution. And then the final one is mission critical. We continue to see big investment in data centers and national security. That is mostly government driven, but there is a good number of private entities that support national security at all levels that continue to see development there.
Great. Well, we have 5 minutes left, so why don't we take time for some questions? I'm supposed to do Slido, but I'm not on my phone. I can't do too many things at one time. But any questions from the audience? Yes, Mr. McCaffrey.
Say that again.
Mansion
Mansion
tax.
tax.
It's very.
ULI.
It's called ULA for those of you who don't know that are down here in Orange County. It's an ordinance that was passed where if a bill, if it was pitched as the mansion tax to sort of say stick it to the rich, but it actually impacts all commercial real estate, and any commercial real estate or residential sale over $5 million is subject to like a 4% tax, and then it goes up based on the price. So, you know, it was largely pitched by the affordable housing. It will have some detrimental impacts for sure. I know people that won't do business in LA City anymore because they don't have to write this into their pro formas. I mean, it's a huge number. And it kicked in on April 1st. So we had a bunch of multi-million-dollar assets trying to be sold before April 1st in Los Angeles. So I think I personally feel that it really hurts LA. The amount of money, we're going to hand over $1 billion to the city of Los Angeles to build housing, and they haven't had exactly the greatest track record building more housing or tackling the homelessness problem. So, but it got passed, so we're going to have to figure out. I mean, there's some efforts, Bob, to over appeal it on several grounds. One is that it disproportionately impacts one industry. You know, homelessness and affordable housing is something that should be shared across everybody, not singularly the real estate sector. So it's of concern, and we are definitely watching it. I get that question almost everywhere I go.
Yeah, I know, you know, I do some work with the Chamber of Commerce up in LA, the women's presidents groups. A lot of groups are, you know, working to try to mitigate some of the impacts. They're really noticing those impacts that I don't think were, the public was not made so aware of during the campaign.
No, I mean, you know, in campaigns in general in the state of California, you really can't. I mean, if you're just looking at the ads, you don't know what's going on. You really have to read the fine print. And, you know, I think in the long term, in terms of jobs and investment in the city of LA, I think it's going to have an adverse impact, unfortunately. You know, and we have office developers who are bringing a product to market now with all that's going on in the market space and fluctuating interest rates. And then you add this tax on top of it, it's pretty onerous to do business in LA. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Considering the underlying market conditions, forecasted unemployment rates, do you think that the residential housing in Orange County is still going to appreciate?
Yeah, well, we've been trying, and I was going to actually ask this as a follow-up question. You know, we've been, you know, interest rate movement is very much tied to labor markets, which haven't been cooperating as much as we'd like. But I mean, what do you think about we have seen some softening in multifamily. We've seen, as the previous panel mentioned, rental coming down or flattening. And I think you're seeing that across most markets, with the exception of those was mentioned, New York. But what do you see for Orange County in terms of multifamily and where vacancy rates are going and where rents are going?
Yeah.
Rental growth.
Right. So this market still remains relatively stronger compared to, say, Phoenix or markets or Las Vegas, for example, markets that had a lot of new construction, whether that be multifamily or single family. So in terms of multifamily, softening of rents, when you look at, when you rank metropolitan areas, Phoenix sort of ranks on top, followed by Las Vegas. Orange County is still not, it's not in the top of growth, but it's still, it falls somewhere in the middle. I think, and it hasn't been declining as fast as the pace as some other areas. In our forecast for home prices, and I've looked at some forecasts for rents, we also do single family rent index that showed a similar thing. So 3 to 4% increase in rents at this point, very similar with home prices. Everything is sort of flattening out, but thinking ahead, reacceleration in some of these trends. So we've seen home prices pretty much bottom out at this point, rents as well. It's spring home buying season. It's also spring is time when a lot of people move around. So rental properties, multifamily properties, and things are pretty positive, in terms of unemployment forecasts. So we are at lowest we've ever been at 3.5%. Most of the forecasts, well, I guess folks after us are going to talk about that, but most of the ones I've seen forecast unemployment going up to 4.5%, which is still historically rather low, and would not necessarily destabilize housing markets in California or Southern California.
Yeah, we're still seeing investment in multifamily and industrial right now. Some of the other sectors are pretty locked up, but we also have the ending of eviction moratoria at the federal, state, and local level. So we'll see how that shakes out the marketplace as well.
Yeah, your question also was about vacancy rates. Vacancy rates too. There's been some increase in vacancy rates, but they still remain historically low. So there will be some going forward as there's more product coming online, and people leaving California, and in general they tend to be renters of lower and moderate income. So those are the properties sort of where I see maybe a little bit more weakness ahead.
Great. Well, our clock has hit 0 right on just a second ago. So join me in thanking the panel for the conversation. Appreciate it. Yeah, it's a pleasure meeting you. Yeah, interesting to watch that.
So many thanks to our panel, and maybe one final comment about ULA that did not appear in the literature about it. That if you are going to build a commercial building in Los Angeles County, there are 88 different jurisdictions. You don't have to do it in the city of Los Angeles. And so that's one of the adverse consequences, is to move those commercial buildings out of the city. Okay, so we're going to start now to try and bring this together in 3 presentations that are forward-looking. The first one on commercial real estate. Then I'm going to talk about the U.S. and California, and Mark, Orange County. So if I can invite Amanda and Mark up, and we'll start with Amanda. Amanda Donson is with the law firm of Allen Matkins. 17 years ago, Allen Matkins came to us at UCLA and said, we do a lot of work in the commercial real estate area. We'd like, as part of our good citizenship, to have you at the UCLA Anderson Forecast do some sort of survey to provide new information about commercial real estate. And that resulted in the Allen Matkins UCLA Anderson Forecast Commercial Real Estate Survey over 8 markets and 4 spaces in the state of California. And it has been surprisingly good in forecasting not only where we're at, but where we're going over the next 3 years. So Amanda Donson is a partner with the Allen Matkins firm. She's widely recognized for her superior client services and attention to detail in complex transactions, including transactions with clients who are developers, home builders, private investors, institutional investors, and global technology companies in industrial, retail, office, and multifamily assets throughout the United States. She's a graduate of UCLA and of Santa Clara University School of Law, where she was cum laude and Order of the Coif, and is recognized here in Orange County, in addition to everything else, for her outstanding pro bono and civic activity. So join me in welcoming Amanda.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jerry, for that introduction. It's great to be here in person. I know over the last couple of years, we've done this online. So to see everybody here and to talk about, what's all important to us on a day-to-day basis is pretty great. I know there are still some people on Zoom, so we're happy to have you guys on there as well. As Jerry mentioned, Allen Matkins partners with UCLA Anderson Forecast on a twice-a-year basis to issue this California commercial real estate survey on the 4 asset types of office, industrial, retail, and multifamily assets up and down the major geographical markets in California. We do this to better predict rental rates, vacancy rates, and just try to get a developer and investor sentiment on the markets. So as we've heard, throughout this entire afternoon and just from living in it on a day-to-day, commercial real estate has been impacted by the level of uncertainty in the economy, higher interest rates, slow economic growth, and I know we just mentioned Measure ULA, so certain legislation that's happening or proposed legislation that will be happening later in the fall. So my role in standing up here for the next few minutes is to just kind of summarize our latest survey results, much of which we've already kind of heard from our prior panels and is consistent with our prior panels. So we'll just dive right in. So we'll start with the office sector. And bear with me, I'm not a professor like a lot of other of you guys, so in using this PowerPoint presentation, but so a year ago, the sentiment for office development was mostly positive across all the geographical markets we surveyed. People are getting vaccinated, they're getting boosted. Employers are thinking that, okay, great, employees are going to come back in. We're all excited. But today, in our most recent survey, office actually has the most negative of the 4 asset types. So in this chart, you can see this dramatic dip between the 2 rightmost columns for each market. So this is kind of a survey and a chart of what's happened over the last few years since 2016. And so obviously starting from the leftmost side, it's June 2016 to the rightmost side. So you can see that dramatic dip between those 2 rightmost columns, especially, in areas like San Francisco. We're looking at Los Angeles, San Diego. So what's causing this dip? One, we've already talked about it. It's this employee sentiment. Employees are pushing back on returning to the office on a full-time basis 5 times a week. There's this notion of a hybrid workplace where we work from home but come into the office, but there's not really a standardized definition of what hybrid is. And the way that we've seen it play out over the last 6-8 months is employers aren't really, even though there's this hybrid notion, hey, come into the office 2 to 3 times a week. What is that? Is that Tuesday through Thursday? Is that Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and maybe you don't show up Friday? So what hybrid is truly not defined or enforced by the employers right now. Second factor is tech firms, which we've discussed as well. We've seen over the last several months the mass layoffs and restructuring at the largest tech firms. And in the office sector, we see tech firms as the growth leaders. So in San Francisco, firms that have previously leased 2 to 3 floors of space, they're now, looking to give up their space. They're looking to sublease. They're looking to figure out ways to kind of manage and mitigate their vacancy. So all of this in combination with higher interest rates and stricter lending conditions make for uncertainty. So on the developer sentiment, I think what we're seeing is folks are sort of waiting on the sidelines. They're taking a wait and see approach. Maybe things will turn around when the economy gets better, the labor market softens, or maybe there's a standardization of what hybrid work really means. And when we are ready to go back out there and develop, I think we can anticipate, and I know our last panel, we had talked about this, but we'll start to anticipate these amenity-rich build-outs, which we're starting to see, I think already, just here in our backyard. The Irvine company's done a great job of implementing that pretty early on at Spectrum Terrace, Innovation Office Park, where there's this emphasis on open air space, a lot of landscaping, accessible areas. I think on our last panel, there was the phrase of high quality. That's pretty much what they're already doing. All right, so we'll move on to retail. Okay, so how many of you think that the sentiment for retail is still negative and positive? Yeah, it's pretty, so, it's retail sentiment is a bit mixed, and I think we can kind of see that in our audience as well. It's a bit mixed depending on the region that we're looking at. But overall, the signs are actually trending more positive. We're expecting to see, I think we've bottomed out of the cycle. We're expecting to see the start of a new cycle within a couple of years by 2025. So we all know we're certainly not seeing demand levels as they were pre-pandemic or pre-large scale e-commerce. And yes, we're seeing closures of our big box retailers. I think I just recently saw Bed Bath & Beyond is going to close another 100 or 200 or just completely liquidate. There's Tuesday Morning, Gap. And these outdated malls that we have here just in our backyards too, those are starting to close up. But there is this demand for a new type of retail, a different configuration of retail. And these are largely due to, one, again, employees working from home. Two, we talked about this in our last panel, just the building of new housing throughout the state. So in areas that are a little bit more places where folks are moving out of from the city into inland. So I know that there's a big housing increase right now in Gilroy, Antioch, Sacramento, Valencia. There may be a little pause in the development of those homes, but the home builders have that land, they're holding on to it. They're sort of taking a wait and see approach until interest rates drop and they see more of a demand from home buyers. But once those homes do develop and the communities build out, with new housing communities comes a need for new retail centers, for grocery anchored especially. So we'll see, I think we'll start to see this with the increase in population in other areas aside from the cities. And there was also this post-pandemic cabin fever of folks wanting to, go outside, have dinner with friends, run errands, grab coffee. There is more of a social aspect to the reconfiguration of retail centers. So it's similar to what we expect to see with office. We're going to see the open air concepts, the patios, landscaping, and family-friendly areas. All right. So we all know that industrial has been the gold star over the last several years. Sentiment from this last survey remains generally stable, but it's not as bullish as it has been in prior years, you can start to see the trend in dip from the second most right column to the far right column. So there's some sort of mixed sentiment, trending negative, and there's this juxtaposition of, we still want to do deals, but it's a little bit difficult to do them. So a lot of what I'm seeing out there in the market right now is, a lot of industrial developers are still looking and searching for deals, in large part because we still have low vacancy rates, high rent growth, there's a lack of supply, and it's getting harder and harder to find land out there to do industrial deals. We also saw, and I know we talked about the measure ULA, but we did see, we saw an increase in deal flow in January, February, and March, trying to sort of escape that mansion tax and try to figure out what to do with all that land and sell it before they get hit with a 5.5% tax. But that being said, we are feeling the impact of a slowdown, especially in areas like the Inland Empire over the last quarter. I think you can see a pretty big, more significant of a dip in the Inland Empire there versus other areas. But so the negative sentiment, I guess, where it's coming from is, one, we have this coalition that went to Governor Newsom a few months back, pushing for a 1 to 2 year moratorium on industrial development. We have cities that are just kind of doing it themselves. The city of Norco has already independently approved a moratorium on warehouse development. At some point, I think it was supposed to be 45 days, but I think it's actually still in effect now. There's also this pending legislation of AB 1000. Has anyone heard of AB 1000? So AB 1000 is currently, I think it's scheduled to go in the fall, but this bill, if it were to pass, would require industrial developments to have a setback of at least 1,000 square feet from what's going to be called sensitive receptors. Sensitive receptors it's not totally defined yet, but it will include centers like schools or daycares or homes. So you'll need to have, when you're doing your site plans and you're underwriting the property, you'll have to see a 1,000 square foot setback. Or there's also kind of an exception to that, the setback being 750 square feet if you meet certain mitigation factors having to do with air control and air quality. So these factors are obviously causing some apprehension about going under contract with sellers, but I'm starting to see acquisitions teams of a lot of my clients using this apprehension and penciling deals in 2 or 3 different ways as a means to negotiate with sellers. So sellers, if they're sophisticated sellers, I think they're coming on board, they're seeing what's happening, they know the impact of potentially AB 1000. So there are ways to kind of try to navigate and pencil deals, but it's just not the same as it was 18 months ago when investors were juggling, all kinds of deals in escrow at one time, and basically sellers had the benefit of bidding wars. That's just not really happening anymore. Okay. And last but not least, and I know we spent some time on this in the last panel as well, the multifamily sector, which remains pretty bullish about the coming 3 years in most of the California markets we surveyed. The 3 markets where the sentiment has dropped are San Francisco and Los Angeles, which is to be expected, and the Inland Empire. In the rest of the Bay Area, so other than San Francisco, there is optimism for multifamily, in part because, again, working from home, we've got remote work and folks wanting to move away from the big cities into larger spaces and more rent-friendly areas. And still provide access, if you're living in the East Bay or if you're living in Silicon Valley, you still have the means to access San Francisco through transit, whether that's, the trains or an hour drive. To the extent that there is some optimism in the inland areas, it's mostly due to the fact that logistics are growing. There's infrastructure construction that's happening. So, and really there's just the housing shortfall with the dynamic on high demand that's outpacing low supply. So multifamily out of the four still remains pretty bullish. I would say office is the least optimistic. And so similar to what we expect for office, new multifamily developments are trending toward amenity-rich complexes with a focus on mixed use, live, work, play. I think we'll see that in the conversion and the redevelopment of the Westminster Mall that we all probably pass every day. I think, is anyone from Shop Off here? I think they just unveiled their plans a couple of days ago, and they've suggested that, in addition to redeveloping the space into multifamily, they'll also have a lot of community spaces, restaurants, retail, a nearby hotel. So if you live in the multifamily, you have parents visiting or friends and family visiting from other states, they can stay right there in the hotel. But also they're planning a 2.5 acre park and an amphitheater. So that's pretty cool. So that's multifamily. So that's basically a brief summary of the 4 asset types from our most recent survey. Again, we do these surveys twice a year. So it's really interesting to kind of see the sentiment of the developers and investors that we survey to kind of predict what vacancy and rental rates will have. If you don't receive our survey and want to start getting them, feel free to shoot me a note. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. And as I think what you saw from the survey, the situation with respect to new development is kind of mixed. And that goes, directly to Carlos's comments about there are some positive notes in commercial real estate as well as some negative ones here in California. So what I want to talk about is the U.S. and California's economic outlook and this uncertain economy. And let's just dive right in. So here's our roadmap. We're going to talk about the U.S. outlook and inflation worries, actually recession inflation worries, and California. And then we're going to go to the wrong slide, but we're not going to talk about tourism, but we are going to talk about migration. So let's start off with GDP. The graph that you see here, the blue is actual GDP numbers. The red and green are 2 scenarios with respect to the economic outlook. And the green line is labeled recession scenario. So Tim said I was going to tell you what the Fed is going to do. I'm not going to do that. And that's because I don't know. To be fair to myself, neither does anyone else, neither does the Fed. So we decided, because the thing that is really influencing the trajectory of the economy is that decision by the Fed and the decisions going forward by the Fed, that we would have two forecasts. One is the Fed continues aggressive interest rate hikes. That's the green line. And the other is that the Fed takes a pause and says, well, what have we wrought? Let's take a look. Let's see where inflation is. And they take a much more moderate stand. And so the difference between the two is the US economy going into a recession or not. And then the dashed line is the trend from 2018, 2019, a 2.4% growth in GDP. And you notice that it's well below where we are today, and it's well below our forecasts. So the question is why? And the answer stems from a change in the labor force. And we've been talking about, particularly in the first panel, all of these important global changes. And one of them has to do with labor force participation. So the graph on the left-hand side, if you look at that, that's labor force participation rate of everyone over age 16. And you see there's a long secular downward trend, drops when we had the lockdown, comes back up, but it doesn't get back to where we were before. And the reason it doesn't get back is on the right-hand side. The right-hand side is boomers. And so this graph, I should have said this in the first place, the left-hand side of the graph along the horizontal is the Great Recession. That's that shaded area and goes all the way to today. And you notice that boomer labor force participation rates increased throughout this period until you got to 2020. Part of that was just people aging into the over 65 cohort. But part of it was we use equity in our homes as part of our retirement savings. And if you remember back to 2008, 2009, 2010, we didn't have any equity in our homes. So those who were planning on retiring didn't have that cushion, didn't have that retirement savings. So they stayed in the labor force. You get to 2020, they're 10 years older, and they have lots of equity in their homes. The economy locks down and says, it's time to retire, and millions of boomers retired. So our labor force shrunk, and if you have fewer people producing things, you have a lower potential GDP. And so if you, let me just stay there for a moment. So if you adjust that black dashed line to that smaller labor force, that smaller potential GDP, it comes right in on top of all of those blocks. And that's the overheated economy that the Fed is looking at. That is our historically low unemployment rates. And so what the Fed is looking at for policy is the inflation rate. And the inflation rate is 5%. That's year over year. So that incorporates price increases that happened 7, 8, 11 months ago, as well as that which is happening more recently. What the Fed is really worried about is in this red circle. This is the 1970s, high and sustained inflation that only came down when interest rates went up to 20%. And we had a big recession. And the Fed is saying, we don't want to get to that point. But if you look further to the left, you get these two, high inflation, but not sustained. That was 1953 and 1947, versus 47 and 53, the end of World War II and the end of the Korean War. We had an economy that was oriented around producing war material. And we had the GIs coming home flush with cash, wanted to spend, but the economy wasn't producing what they wanted. That's like a supply chain constraint. You come out of the 2020 recession, unusual because it's a pandemic-induced recession. So it wasn't because the economy had imbalances. We had big transfers to households. Households came out of that recession with lots of cash and wanted to spend. So how much is the two of this 5% are the two arrows, and how much is in the red circle? Again, no one really knows. And the Fed is saying, we're going to err on the side of thinking it's more in the red circle than the two arrows. So what's been happening in the past 6 months? CPI inflation, 3.5%. It's coming down. The Fed is looking at that, and they're trying to decide, do we take that moderate, or do we continue the aggressive increases in interest rates? And so let's look at the Fed's record. So this is a graph of federal funds rate. That's what the Fed controls. The red lines are increases, the blue are decreases, and the dots are when the Fed changed its policy direction. And there are only 8 dots here. So if you remember back to your statistics class, 8 observations is a small sample. Really hard to do inference with a small sample, but this is what we have. So let's look at this. The red dots here are when the Fed changed policy and a recession ensued. Not necessarily causal. The interest rates didn't necessarily cause the recession, but they're certainly correlated. And the green dots, where the Fed changed policy direction and there was no near-term recession. There are only 2 green dots and 6 red dots. So the historical record of being able to hit a green dot, what people are calling a soft landing, isn't that good. And again, continuing the theme about who knows, the Fed doesn't know where a green dot is. And to be fair, neither do we. So they're flying blind in this sense. And that's why we have 2 scenarios. But what may help the Fed get to a green dot is consumption remains strong. So this is a real consumption. And if we take a trend line, yes, real consumption has backed off a little bit, but it was way above trend. This is us going out and spending, but we've been above trend for a while. And so it's kind of coming back towards trend, and it's coming back slowly towards trend. And that strong consumption, which is 70% of GDP demand, could indeed save the Fed. The other thing that might save the Fed and help them hit a green dot is this is a much more dangerous world. And this is something that Leonard was talking about in the global trends. Because it's a more dangerous world, real defense spending is going up. In the US, up 8% in the latest budget. In the next budget, it's going to go up again. And our allies in Europe and Asia are also increasing their defense budgets. And admittedly, they're going to buy things locally, but they're also going to be buying from the US. And this is disproportionately beneficial to California, disproportionately beneficial to this part of California, because we produce the sophisticated components for defense durable goods here, and we develop them here. And that means that we're going to receive more than our population proportionate share of that demand. And the important thing about this is not interest sensitive. So the Fed's raising interest rates, it's not going to matter for this demand. So let's turn to California. That was kind of an introduction. That's one of the elements in the California economy that is going to help us here not have as bad a recession if we do have a recession, or not as much of a slowdown if we do have a slowdown than the rest of the US. And I'm going to show you some other ones. But I like this National Review. This is actually a special issue of the National Review. California leaving. What I really like about it is you see these cars that are presumably they're moving to Arizona or Texas or someplace, and they're pulling their U-Hauls. But look where they're at. They're Big Sur. So I don't think they're going to Phoenix, maybe Morro Bay. But as was pointed out in the last panel, California's lost hundreds of thousands of people. So what's going on? Is this the new Rust Belt? You know, in spite of the defense buildup, are we, in for an implosion of the California economy? One way to look at this is to look at GDP. Now, of course, GDP depends on the number of people, right? So China has the second largest GDP in the world because they have 1.4 billion people doing stuff, right? But they're still a poor country. And we know that there's been a lot of migration, including this out-migration from California. So let's look at GDP in terms of per capita GDP. So taking the migration issue out, and here we have per capita GDP growth rates from 2019 through 2022. 2022 quarter four is the last one we have. This is by state, and these are the large states. So what I did was I took the 22 largest states, which make up 81% of US GDP. The other states have 1% or less of GDP. The US is all the way over on the right-hand side, and you see California there shaded in gold. It's not number one. If we go back further in time, it actually would be number one or number two to the state of Washington, but not bad. California is certainly growing much faster than the US, and that's not a Rust Belt state. That's not a state that's imploding. So what is happening there in terms of migration, and this actually affects housing and housing prices here in Orange County. What's happening is we have churn going on. We have people moving out in part because of housing prices, and they're moving. Those who are moving out have larger families and tend to be lower income, and those who are moving in are smaller household units, more highly educated, more income. And if you notice on the streets, I think that's the next slide. No, let's do this first. But if you notice on the streets when you're commuting, is anyone's commute become easier in terms of traffic? No. And I'm gonna come back to this. And that's because of this. We lost 16% of our payroll jobs in the lockdown in 2020. We are now 1.7% more payroll jobs than we had prior to the pandemic. We have more people working. We just have smaller household sizes, right? And that's a lot of what's been going on in the migration. But you know, the migration's been significant. So how long is that going to go on, particularly because of this differential in housing prices? So here I'm going to go back. And what this is it compares the premium that was paid for the California lifestyle in 2016, median house price to median house price on city pairs, to today. And California housing is not more affordable today, but it's relatively more affordable. So if you look at this, this is a whole bunch of city pairs, and including, for example, Orange County and Phoenix. And most of them are in the 20 to 25% differential. And what that means is that if you sold your house here in 2016, you could buy 20% or more housing in Phoenix than you can today, which lessens the incentive to migrate. And the top one you see there, the red one, is Los Angeles, Dallas. Doesn't change by a lot. Recently, it's gone down by 10%, but it's been actually fairly stable. And if one looks at the migration data, because you think everybody's moving from Los Angeles to Dallas, it's almost zero. And the same is true with Atlanta. Plenty of Angelinos have moved to Dallas. Plenty of Texans have moved from Dallas to Los Angeles. And the net migration is close to zero. So with this decrease in relative unaffordability, we expect that outmigration to taper off. It's not going to end immediately, but to taper off. Okay, and we looked at this. So we have more jobs than before. And then here's another example of the churn that we have. And that is on the right-hand side, we have other services, wholesale trade, leisure and hospitality, and education. They tend to be lower income sectors, and they have not recovered from the drop in employment in 2020. But on the right-hand side, what we have is logistics and information and professional and scientific and technical services. So tech and logistics and manufacturing. And we were talking about in the earlier panels, manufacturing. These are growth sectors along with the one all the way over on the left, which is healthcare. These are growth sectors that more than made up for the numerical loss in jobs. But the people on the right-hand side are, as we talked about earlier, tending to move out, more highly educated on the left-hand side, moving in. So this is the churn that's happening all throughout California, but in particular in the coastal parts of California, such as here in Orange County. And manufacturing, let's dig into that. We are at record employment in manufacturing since prior to 2007. You can see that in this graph. But what is really important in this is looking at productivity in manufacturing. That this is selected states, and here's California all the way over on the left. Productivity in manufacturing in California has jumped way up. And if you go all the way over the right, North Carolina, it's been negative. It's not because people in North Carolina are busy on TikTok and not working, and people in California put their phones away and are working harder. It's that we're doing different kinds of manufacturing. We're doing advanced manufacturing here, you get more of the traditional manufacturing in North Carolina. Again, part of the churn and the change in the nature of our economy. And then to go back to defense, this is where our defense dollars being spent by state. These are the top 10, and it just about exhausts the defense budget. Texas, Virginia, California, Maryland, Florida, Connecticut make up the top 6. Some of those because they have large bases in the state, but certainly Texas and California and Connecticut, that's defense durable goods manufacturing. And so that again is going to help protect the state. So what about tech? We've heard about the tech layoffs. This is professional, scientific, and technical services payroll employment through March of this year. I don't see the layoffs here. They're not there. This is tech, and this is where that tech lives. The layoffs aren't there. So what is happening? Why don't you see that? Because we know the layoffs are happening. One of the reasons is we still have a strong, vibrant tech sector. So for example, when Twitter shrunk their labor force one way or another from 7,500 to 2,500, there were only 900 Californians laid off. And according to Forbes, 300 of them were employed the same week. So the smaller tech firms are picking up the slack. We see that here. We see it also in the state of Washington with the layoffs at Amazon. And one of the things that's helping out is that we have had a lot of VC investment. So this is venture capital investment 2022 on the left-hand side is Bay Area, then New York, then Los Angeles, and that's greater Los Angeles. So that's LA and Orange County, and it's number 3. So a lot of VC money is coming in, and that came in more in the early part of 2022 than more recently. And in the fourth quarter of 2022, early stage funding held up here. And those are the firms that are hiring. Is late stage funding that was at a 4-year low, but we do have this. What are the implications of Silicon Valley Bank? Well, so far looks okay, but that was the case with Bear Stearns, right? So we don't know what systemic risk is sitting in the non-bank financial sector. And so that's something that we've got to keep our eye on. Okay, so for housing markets, and Selma told you a lot about what's going on in housing markets. This is the median home price in California, down 8.6%, and sales are down at recession levels. So you would think that that would mean that new home construction had collapsed in California. But when we look at new home construction across states, what we find is that California, there is in blue, it's actually close to 0 in 2022, a little bit negative, but other states are having a much greater decrease in new home construction. And just looking at January and February 2022 compared to January, February 2023, again, California's negative. We expect that. But compared to the rest of the US, not as bad, which means that the impact of interest rates on residential construction here is going to be less. And part of that is what Amanda showed you in terms of the demand for multifamily housing. And part of that is a derivative of the new products that the state legislature has put into play with 3 Senate bills and 3 Assembly bills, things like ADUs. And so they have low-hanging fruit that developers are able to take advantage of. So yes, a shrinkage, but not as much as in the US. And so to summarize, what makes California's forecast different from the US, particularly that green line, is leisure and hospitality is going to pick up. And this is what we talked about in the first panel with the Chinese tourists coming back past 0 COVID. Manufacturing, high tech, and defense and aerospace still going strong. In tech is okay for now, but again, we don't know what's going to happen subsequently because of Silicon Valley Bank and what that might have represented. Construction, our new housing laws, and as you saw in Amanda's presentation, industrial, backing off a bit, but backing off a bit from a very hot market with 1% or sub 3% vacancy rates. And we haven't talked about government, but there's a big rainy day fund sitting there in Sacramento, which is larger than any projection of deficits, kind of in spite of the Sacramento speak on the subject. And so what that means is that if the Fed hits a green dot, or if the US economy hits a green dot, California is going to still be a booming economy. And in particular, this part of California will be. If the Fed hits a red dot and we have a recession, it's possible California might not even go into a recession. We will have a slowing economy, but if we do have a recession, for the first time in 5 recessions, we will have the mild recession compared to the rest of the US. So that concludes the US and California. Let's now drill down to Orange County with Mark Schneep. Mark is president of the California Forecast. Mark received his PhD from our sister school, University of California, Santa Barbara. And he, with his colleagues at the California Forecast, do amazing work in looking at county by county what's happening in the state of California. So please give it up for Mark Schneep.
All right. Good afternoon. So I'm entitling this cooling off slightly, because that's about all I can really assess regarding the local economy here. There we go. But as I talk about this, and as I go through kind of sector by sector, at least the important ones in Orange County, because there's mixed things going on. I kind of want to, I normally do this too. I normally gain the pulse of how you believe the economy is doing right now. So it's a quiz, it's the only quiz. So just answer with your hands, the best answer that that best represents how you feel about the economy. So here, the worst is over. Business will only pick up from here. Who says that? Dang. There's actually more than 0. All right. Couple of optimists. All right, 2. Modest growth, but no recession. Okay, Jerry kind of alluded to that scenario. I mean, he's even raising his hand. Okay, a few more of you, maybe 10%. A mild recession this quarter or next. Who says that? Okay, about 20% of you. All right. Recession with a capital R. All right. Mixed bag. How about this? I'm off to Montana to hunker down. Right? Who thinks that? You know, the end is near, or is it? You know, as Jerry talked about, we could have a mixed bag depending upon just what the Fed does do. So, let me talk about that. This is a slide that I showed you last year about what our forecast assertions were going to be. So again, this was a year ago. In fact, we gave this conference on the 27th of April. So we're pretty much a full year back then. So what we said is the tailwinds were very strong at that time. We had a lot of momentum in Orange County, and the outlook for 22 looked fairly certain, at least to us it did. Full employed economy, labor force was starting to return, visitors were coming back to 2019 numbers, everything had opened up, there was a lot of momentum. The development surge had resumed from the pandemic, and so we didn't think that there was going to be any major change. But we did cite risks, okay? And we did also admit that housing was going to face some major headwinds at that time. Okay, here were the risks that we talked about. Inflation, all right, which kind of continued. Interest rates, the geopolitical events, particularly the war, any new relapses of the pandemic, And then, of course, the Barrick stock market. And so nearly all of these actually ended up being true to some extent. And so they tended to, but they didn't tend to really derail the economy any. We didn't get the pandemic problem. We did get a bearish stock market. It kind of hit its low last September. It's been fine since then. Inflation is starting to come back down, as you know, and interest rates have certainly leveled off and actually come back down. So now what's going on this year? All right. So here's what I've been able to ascertain about Orange County so far, first 4 months in. There are key engines of growth that are really driving this economy right now that don't look like they're going to cool off much. All right. And that's the labor markets, particularly in tech and in aerospace. All right. That advanced manufacturing in aerospace too, that Jerry had alluded to. Tourism is coming back big time, is back big time. In fact, maybe even more so. And then development. The development that's going on here is probably the most underrated engine of growth that we're seeing regarding Orange County. I'll talk about that today. So here's the overall status. Labor markets are fully employed. Needless to say, development is surging again. Tourism has never been better. Technology, well, the job counts are at record levels that we're seeing. Residential real estate, clearly weak in sales. All right, there are a number of reasons for that, but there's some clearly obvious ones that you know about. And then the office market continues to weaken. Let me talk a little bit about this. It's been talked about a lot today, so I won't say that much. But you know, one of the things, this is office using employment, and we tend to use this indicator, right, in order to predict which way the office market is going. Because if there's people that need office space, I mean, and then they're utilizing it, and that vacancy rates go down and rents tend to go up. All right, well, that doesn't work anymore, because even though this is the current employment of office using people, they're not using the office anymore. So it's not a predictable indicator. So here we are at all-time record highs. This was the pandemic peak, so we've eclipsed that now. This would normally say, hey, office market should be doing great, but it's not. All right. We predicted this broad recovery last year because we saw office market improving, but it didn't. And that's because, of course, if you've heard today and know about office market, remote work has just become too ingrained. Firms have relaxed worker requirements, and we all know that. So net absorption in Orange County has been basically negative for the last 3.5 years. In fact, firms are starting to give up a lot more office space than ever before, or at least they're trying to. So here, this is a telling indicator. Here's vacant office space for sublease. All-time record high in Orange County, 2.5 million square feet. All right. So again, people are trying to get rid of it. Here's the office sector vacancy rate in Orange County, and it's ticked up. We've got 21 million square feet that is essentially vacant. All right, available and vacant. So you got 21 million square feet of office space, not really, probably some of it is, but much of it is not generating revenue, right? It's not to landlords. So and then we've got these credit vulnerabilities that have been alluded to here. So we think the regional bank issue is on solid ground after the Silicon Valley Bank, Signature, First Republic issues. But that's really not the big issue now. The big issue is that credit has tightened so much, and there's no expectations for that to ease. And now we have this wave of commercial real estate refinancing that's basically funded by regional banks with credit tightening. And now without net operating income high enough on a lot of these buildings because of the vacancies, there's some vulnerability for the office sector, needless to say. So we're watching this very carefully, but that's one of the biggest vulnerabilities that we see in Orange County right now. Okay, so that's one of the major issues that is haunting the California economy right now. The other one, of course, is all the tech layoffs that have gotten such celebrated PR over the last 6 months. Here's the biggest tech layoffs that we've seen over the last 6 months. And the beige ones are this year and the white ones are, October, November of last year. So there's been a spate of them. Here's the numbers, right? I mean, thousands of layoffs, right? But when I look at the total numbers coming out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics on layoffs in California, you don't see them rising much. This is data through February, right? Yes, there's a lot, but as Jerry indicated, a lot of these are not occurring here in the state. And then when I look at Orange County year by year, I mean, here's the layoff numbers that come out of the Warren system. All right. And this year, through the first 4 months, it's about 2742. Now, layoffs tend to be seasonal. They tend to be the highest in what month? Anyone know? No one wants to guess. January. Why? Because employers don't want to let anybody off at Christmas. Exactly. Okay. So the bulk of the layoffs in Orange County are now behind us. So will that get back up to a level, say, like 2018? Maybe, but probably not. So you really don't see an excessive number of layoffs that have occurred. One of the biggest companies that have laid off people in Orange County is Rivian, the e-vehicle company. But other than that, there's really not a lot of tech layoffs, not at all. Here's tech employment, which I define this way: design, web, scientific consulting, and semiconductor manufacturing. And it effectively is at an all-time high. And this is data through March. So we don't see a major shrinkage. The layoff contagion has not really hit Orange County, and for that matter, California. Here's the unemployment rate. It's still extremely low. It's come up just a tiny bit, but really not much. So you don't see it in the labor markets indicators. We don't see it in the unemployment claims in California. So I cut this off because it goes way high, as you know, in the pandemic. But here's the unemployment claims through March in California. And yeah, there's these spikes, but these are this is the January effect. Okay. So again, we don't see it. Layoffs are really not producing the kind of misery that you would normally identify layoffs with. So that's just been absent. No increase in the unemployment rate, unemployment claims. Where are these workers going? Well, they're going to the next spot because we've got so many openings for jobs. So they're getting rehired. Labor market is still extremely tight. Here's the most recent job growth that we've seen over, say, the last 20 months in Southern California. So that's San Diego. And, job growth is starting to fade because all of the run up from reinstating all the pandemic jobs, has kind of run its course. So growth is starting to return to a more normalized rate. And Orange County is second. Inland Empire, as you can see, is falling off in pink. But nevertheless, job growth is still quite robust right now in many Southern California counties, running anywhere between 2.5% and 3.5%. With a fully employed economy still. So, but the decline is not necessarily due to demand. No, it's due to what Jerry had alluded to earlier, and that's the labor force. So here's the labor force in Orange County, right? We're not back here as of March. We're not back to where we were pre-pandemic due to a lot of factors. In fact, the county here is 24,000 people short. So where are these people? Yes, some of them retired. But where are the rest of them? Well, we've had major outflow of migrants. So a lot of them have simply defected elsewhere, other counties, other states. And you can see that it's been quite prolific in the last few years. In fact, over the last 5 years, we've had nearly 100,000 more people leave Orange County than came in. Okay, so that's a net effect. So again, defections from Orange County due to what? Due to housing availability and affordability for the most part. Here's job openings in Orange County by company. And I presented this last year. And so this was the numbers last year. It was April 26th of a year ago. And this was the number of job openings at each one of these companies. Okay, and the ones in check marks are healthcare. So heavily weighted towards healthcare, which still needs a lot of people. Now, here's the update. A year later, here we are a year later. A lot of these job openings are a lot less. So yes, there's been a cooling off. Not in all cases are they less, but in most cases they're less. And they're significantly less for Boeing, who was the leader and now hardly has any. All right, so we had about 100,000 job ads. Orange County is now down to just under 70,000. So there, you can see the labor market is slowing down just a tad to some extent. Okay, what happened to Boeing? Well, they probably filled all those. Here, aerospace employment, all-time high. Well, all-time high since 2008, I should say, in Orange County. So Orange County is definitely contributing overall to the impact that is occurring statewide. Okay, very strong manufacturing growth, particularly in advanced manufacturing sectors such as aerospace. We're also seeing the amusement, recreation industry come back big time with tourism. And so we're now back to the levels that we were at pre-pandemic. So that's come back with tourism. Okay, look at passenger counts at the local airport, now at record highs in 2022. So that sector's completely recovered. In fact, the first couple of months of this year are showing an increase over last year for the first 2 months. So John Wayne continues to garner a lot more activity right now, and there's no slowdown there. Hotel motel occupancy rates are nearly back up to pandemic levels. Probably won't quite get there. The difference between now and then is about 3,000 or 4,000 new hotel rooms that have come on the scene that visitors would have to completely occupy at the same rate. So that's what's slowing things down. We've certainly got more visitors, just a lot more space to accommodate them. And then Disneyland. I always use Disneyland as one of my main indicators of tourism, of course. And the estimates give us a number last year that was at least equal to the previous high, if not slightly higher. So a complete return of visitors at Disneyland. And we can know that because we look at the wait times. So you go to thrillData.com and there's all these statistics about Disneyland and wait times by hour and whatever the case may be. But this is the last 16, 18 months. And so this was January, February, March, and April of a year ago. And this is January, February, March, and April of this year. So last year is a little bit more crowded. Wait times are a little bit higher. So there may be slight cooling off at Disneyland this year. I don't know. We'll see. Maybe once those Chinese visitors show up in bigger numbers, this will change, but maybe a slight cooling. All right, we talk a lot about home prices. So, and we just talked about it. So let me just show you. So this is California Association of Realtors data. All right. And this was the peak that everybody talked about. This is April of a year ago for Orange County, little over 1.3 million for the median selling value, okay? And you can see how it's eroded from April all the way to nearly the end of the year. That the end of the year, or the last bar I have there is November. So what's happened since November? Oh, by the way, that decline from peak to the bottom there was 15%. The 15% represents the mix of what's selling, not necessarily the value of real estate in general, but the mix of what's sold, right? So since then, now we've seen this happen. So this is December, January, February, March. So it has turned its corner and it has risen again up another up 12% from that bottom. So real estate may have already run its little cycle here. Sales are still weak, but one of the reasons sales are so weak is because inventory is, for all intents and purposes, at an all-time record low. There's nothing for sale. Okay, sellers don't want to sell in a depressed market, but now with prices perhaps rising again, or at least stabilizing, there will be more inventory that comes online. Okay. By the way, back in the Great Recession, right there, that's the end March of 08, during the Great Recession, inventory was 7 times as high as it was now. 7 times. So supply and demand situation is really driving this market now, and not speculative or bubble-like conditions. Let me talk about new development. So here is office, industrial, and retail buildings under construction in terms of square feet year by year. Okay, there's the last 3 years, including this year. The number are not quite as high as it was back in 2015, 2016, when we had a lot more hotels, when the spectrum was being built out in big waves back then. So almost as high, but not quite the same. What is very different is, of that mix, most of it is here, industrial. Industrial run-up is at all-time record highs in Orange County, well, at least as far as data goes back. So we're seeing the biggest surge in industrial development that we can evaluate for Orange County, given the data that we have. So look at that. The surge is unbelievable right now. And what are these? The Goodman Logistics Center in Fullerton, that's pretty much finished. It's wrapping up right now. It's got 1.5 million. It's been building for the last 2.5 years. It's only got 3 tenants to take up all that space. And it's all taken, it's 100%. And it's just about ready to be operational in full. And then now we have a new one, the Huntington Gateway Business Park, 1 million square feet. It's underway. 70% of it is already pre-leased. So that's going to be real successful. You got another hotel underway, the Tower in the Disneyland Resort, and that's fully underway right now. That will open next year. And then, of course, and Ed talked about this on the first panel, the OC Vibe project, which is $4 billion being underwritten by the owners of the Ducks, right? It was approved by the city last September in Anaheim, and it will break ground this year and hopefully be done by the Olympics. What they want to, they want to have that ready for the Olympics in 2028. So here's what it looks like, right? Here's the Honda Center right there. So that exists, but a lot of this other stuff doesn't. It's all parking lot. Okay, so it's big. It's 1,500 units of condos and apartments, 2 big hotels, 1 million square feet of office. Probably be quite creative office. Concert halls, theaters, 2 parks, lots of parking. It's going to be huge. It's a mega development. Okay, so they're trying to get that. This is going to take up a lot of construction resources over the next 5 years. All right. The other major construction that's going on is all the apartments. Okay, the apartments under construction, nearly 9,000 right now. Okay, and a lot of them, a lot of the previous ones in the previous bars here have already been delivered to the market in big waves. Okay, so the huge development in Orange County, the biggest, again, as I said, this is the biggest engine of growth that we've seen. We've had so many apartments delivered quickly to the market. As Selma said, the vacancy rates have risen because they can't get absorbed that fast. But they're back, they're just sort of rising to a more normalized vacancy rate in Orange County. So it's not something to be concerned with yet. And rents have leveled off, as they have indicated. Residential developments, One Metro West in Costa Mesa, over 1,000 apartments plus retail connected to housing again. And this now can proceed with the passage of Measure K in November. So this is likely to break ground this year. Another 1,000 apartments. 3rd and Broadway in Santa Ana, another big thing. This will break ground this year as well. That kind of revitalizes downtown Santa Ana as along with so many other projects that have been going on there. And then you've got all the established housing centers right now in the South County, the Great Park. The city wants to build the aquatic center to support the Olympics by 2028. So they're trying to figure out now the budget for that to get that built. But that's another big project that will be underway if they can obtain the funding. And then, of course, you've got Rancho Mission Viejo, one of the largest projects in all of Southern California that continues to build. 4 more neighborhoods have been released. 300 homes are now underway. Major activity in the county. And I just talked about the major ones. So here's construction employment through March in Orange County. It's at an all-time high right now. How is it going to go higher? Can it go higher? Where are the workers? The unemployment rate for the construction industry is the lowest it's been in 20 years. That's how long data has been tracked by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's really hard to find construction workers, and yet there are all these projects that are about ready to break ground or start again here. So this is an issue that Orange County is going to be facing. Here, let me quickly talk about the forecast and then I'm done. So here's the summary. The labor markets are probably going to remain more or less fully utilized. The commuting population will face the layoffs, probably not the resident population. They will be able to fill the jobs. We don't see any bubble. Don't think about that. Out-migration is probably going to continue. All right. Population in Orange County, which has been in decline since 2018, is going to continue, and that's going to mute the labor force growth. I mean, it'll grow some, but not much. And I think that can become a major concern for the labor markets over the next several years. New development will continue, particularly with the start of all these mixed use projects. Housing production this year will be similar to last, but it'll start the tapering off. Real quickly, there's the labor force. It will come back some this year, but the rate of growth that we saw previously, that's not going to return because the population isn't here. Population continued to decline. All right. Job creation. This was our forecast last year. We forecast that we'd have pretty stellar job growth in 2022. And then in 2023, this is what happened. We had a huge monster year in 2022. So we won't have as many jobs this year. Housing production tapers off, as I indicated. Still provides it. And all of these forecasts are detailed in our new edition of the Orange County book. So get your hands on it. That's out. And that's the forecast for OC this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And you probably thought we were having the reception afterwards because it was all going to be doom and gloom, but it's actually a celebratory reception. But before we go to the reception, I do want to thank our sponsors again. Again, we're public institutions, UCI and UCLA, and we could not do these programs without our sponsor support. So our principal sponsor today is RSM. Our platinum sponsor is the law firm of Allen Matkins, California Bank and Trust, Cathay Bank, Clark Construction, Leap Development, and University Credit Union. The gold level is Hub International and Pacific Western Bank. At the silver level, Hathaway Dinwiddie and Manufacturers Bank. At the bronze level, MBK Real Estate, and our academic sponsor, UCLA Extension. And by the way, if you did not hear your organization's name, we can take care of that for next year. So just let us know. And thank you all for coming. The reception is going to be kind of down the hall here and to the left. And this brings our program to a close. Thank you.